Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is the Leonine Heresy in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Warzone, Fenris. A Saga of Spite and Vengeance Part 1. The wall on which the prophets wrote is cracking at the seams. Upon the instruments of death the sunlight brightly gleams. When every man is torn apart with nightmares and with dreams, will no one lay the laurel wreath when silence drowns the screams? For 10,000 years, the space wolves have prowled the stars, defenders of an untrusting imperium. Though they have served loyally, their methods have aroused a great deal of suspicion, as well as the ire of both allies and foes who would like nothing more than to see the sons of Rus brought low. In the ancient past, the 6th Legion came to blows against Magnus the Red and with his accursed sorcererkin, who cast them into the warp in a treacherous assault at the beginning of the Leonine Heresy. Yet in the end, the mighty Leman Russ would obtain his revenge, destroying Prospero, homeworld of the 15th Legion. Though the Lord of Winter and War no longer walks among his sons, the court of the Crimson King has not forgotten this most ancient grudge. Now, with the space wolves distracted and spread ever more thinly across the stars to protect those who fear and resent them, the Thousand Sons and their demonic allies close in, preparing to deal a deadly blow to their enemy's home, Fenris, with the unwitting aid of those who ought to be the wolves' battle brothers. Chapter 1, Fire Marks. The galaxy burns. Across the Imperium, a thousand foes press in on every side. It is a time of ending, in more ways than one, for as M41 comes to a close, so too does mankind's last hopes for survival. 10,000 years of unending war have drained Terra's defenders, and the titanic struggles of M39-M41 have seen countless resources expended on short-lived triumphs, the so-called waning. During this time, thousands of new worlds were claimed in the name of the Master of Mankind, an opening of new fronts that an already overstretched empire could ill afford to maintain. Now the many horrors of our galaxy have redoubled their assaults, closing in to reclaim their worlds and swamp the realms of man in shadow. Against them stands the innumerable armies of the Imperial Guard, the Adeptus Auroritas, and of course, the mighty legions Asteroutes. Where once they conquered the entire galaxy in the span of a few centuries, the 9 remaining legions have now become reaction forces, desperately putting out stellar blazes lest they engulf more systems in the fire of war. The 6th Legion, the redoubtable Space Wolves, are the very epitome of this heroic effort. From their home world, the icy death world known as Fenris, the Space Wolves venture out across the galaxy in great hunts as they track down all manner of foes. From rampaging greenskin hordes, to Tyranid splinter fleet incursions, to rebellions of the lost and the damned, the sons of Rus have crossed blades with every foe to ever threaten the Imperium of Man. Where other loyalist legions confine their patrols to certain sectors, the Space Wolves roam the entire galaxy, only maintaining permanent garrisons around eternal threats such as the Eye of Terror or the Maelstrom. Fenris System. Located on the same galactic arm as Holy Terra, the Forbidden System of Fenris sits at the heart of the Lupus Nebula, just inside the borders of Segmentum Solar. Fenris itself holds less than 5 million inhabitants, and thus the bulk of the system's population comes from the other worlds, from Valdramani, Hermoon, to the subsurface hives of Midgardia, to the similarly icy Frostheim. Around the home of the Space Wolves lies a collection of hostile sectors, for this region of space is filled with monstrous Xenos and savage despots. To its south is the Armageddon Gate, where war against the Orcs has begun to reach a fever-pitch intensity, while the Eye of Terror sits northwest, perpetually vomiting abominations that must be caught and destroyed. There are few Imperial worlds in this region of Segmentum Solar, for most have been scoured clean by the Space Wolves themselves, who have no wish for outsiders to come prying into their business. Yet due to their small size, the Space Wolves are perhaps the most burdened of all the 9. As of the waning days of M41, barely 70,000 warriors, spread unevenly across a dozen great companies, now prowl the stars, unleashing the wrath of Fenris upon all who would oppose the Alfather's will. A full third of the Legion has already sailed west, to join in the defense of the Cadian Gate, where the destroyer's forces are expected to arrive any day now. Another third is scattered across the Imperium, tied down in protracted struggles against rebellious systems. The remaining great companies remain on patrol, the fiercely independent Jarls now reluctantly receiving their assignments issued from Fenris. At the center of the Eat, the famed citadel of the Space Wolves, Harfylker Logan Grimner holds his court, accompanied by his senior advisors. Where the rest of the Death World heaves with tectonic fury, the Fang remains safe and secure, a remote mountain at the heart of Asaheim, the largest continent. However, this isolation has become lonely as of late, for with the Legion pressed harder than ever before, the great feasting halls built to hold tens of thousands now contain a scant 5,000, 3/5 of whom now ready themselves to leave along with the Harfylker himself. The Kadayan Gate has already taken a third of the 6th Legion, and now it will take more, for Grimner and his chosen warriors now go to reinforce them. As he readied himself to depart, the old wolf took a moment to recall the past, reliving his memories once more. "Are you sure, High Priest?" asked Grimner, stroking his white beard. Opposite him stood Ulrich the Slayer, the oldest living son of Rus, whose totems rattled as he nodded. "Aye, my king. The Oaken Yugr have been spotted on more than a dozen worlds in the past year alone. Something is driving them to return, and many of them are far from loyal. I fear the end times draw near." "Surely it is not all doom and gloom," interjected Ragnar. Both Grimner and Ulrich turned to look at the Jarl, the only other senior commander present. Blackmane had held the title of Jarl for barely a few decades, and as such, was known to all as the Young Wolf to parallel Grimner's epithet of Old Wolf. After all, if the lost kin are coming back, Rus himself can't be far behind. "I admire your optimism, lad, but the last saga is only a legend. And they are not to be trusted." "What do you mean, Ulrich?" asked Grimner. Ulrich's gentle smile settled back into its usual frown, hidden amidst the lines of his weathered face. "My interrogation yielded much bad news, I'm afraid. The last outlaw my men apprehended, a wretch calling himself Grimmer Rediron, was taken in the midst of a battle against the Grey Knights. He claimed to have been hunting for a son of the Crimson King known as the Hopeful for untold millennia, but such a story beggars belief. As it is, I can only hope the Sons of Titan were unaware of his true origin." "Indeed," nodded Grimner. "Young Ragnar, I have a task for you. Take your pick of the men, and seek out these Oaken Yugr. Bring them back, alive if you can. I feel something is amiss, that we're not seeing the whole picture." Blackmane saluted before striding out of the hall. Grimner's recollection was shattered by the sound of a beep, his keen senses instantly putting him on alert. Only then did his conscious mind make sense of the threat his subconscious had picked up on. It was no foe, only the chirp of his comms unit. As expected, it was his old companion Ulrich, though the message he bore was of a kind entirely different from the one he had given years ago at their meeting with Ragnar, whose company had been absent ever since. The Slayer's voice was as grim as ever as he explained the reason for his interruption. Demonic incursions had been detected across the Fenris system. How this had come to pass was unknown, but such a slight to the Legion's honor could not be ignored. In the days to come, this intrusion would be noted in the Legion's annals as a fire mark, retroactively declared as such to note it as part of the momentous struggle it was a part of. The earliest of these was fire marks -7, -6, and -5, all of which marked times where the great companies of the Space Wolves departed Fenris to hunt down chaos incursions across the galaxy. In hindsight, these invasions, spearheaded by the Thousand Sons and their chaotic allies, were clearly designed to denude the Fenris system of her protectors. However, honor demanded the Sons of Rus protect the worlds under their keep, and the Legion's commanders held no regret. With Fenris itself now under threat in what would be titled as Fire Mark -4, the worlds of the Space Wolves now faced a danger even greater than they had during the Battle of the Fang, back in M33. In response to this affront, High King Grimner unleashed the Svate present on Fenris to deal with these threats and buy time for the Astropaths to call for aid. Fire Mark -3 marked Jarl Krom Dragongaze and his forces coming to the rescue of Valdramani, the Wolf's moon orbiting above Fenris herself. The notoriously violent Dragongaze was the only Jarl present in the system aside from High King Logan Grimner, and thus it was he who was the first of the Sons of Rus to respond to this invasion. His great company Tra-Tra, the mighty Ninth who were known as the Drake Slayers, numbered just over 6,000 warriors on paper, though much of this strength was elsewhere, manning the many defensive emplacements and watchtowers built around the Eye of Terror and other permanent warp storms. Thus only a mere 2,000 legionaries, the bulk of the Space Wolves present in the Fenris system, stood by Jarl Krom's side as they landed on Valdramani in a full-scale drop pod assault. Against this mighty force seeking to liberate the Wolf's Moon were the Epicurean cohorts of Maligen-Yl Needletongue. Claiming the title of prince over a warband known as the Infernal Tetrad, Needletongue's armies were a lurid assortment of murderers and hedonists, sybaritic abominations who had transformed the barren deserts of Valdramani into a eye-watering canvas whose perverted beauty delighted their creators as much as it revolted the sons of Rus. Once a radiation-soaked backwater, Valdramani had little to offer besides the Long Howl Astropath Station, a domed city which ferried messages to Fenris from the rest of the Imperium. As such, it had little in the way of defenses, and thus the daemons of Slaanesh had made great sport of the helpless civilians. As the forces of Dragongaze closed in on the domed city, protected from the radiation by their armor, they noted with righteous repugnance the horrors wrought on their moon. Along the highway leading from the spaceport, dozens of astropaths lay impaled upon their own force staves, their blind eyes and contorted expressions a mute testament to the atrocities inflicted on them. The crushed fragments of desecrated imperial symbols lay strewn at their feet, and as the space wolves marched closer to the relay station, they quickly came under attack. From the skies, viscous fluids began to rain down, a foul-smelling downpour with the telltale sickly sweet scent of chaos which slowed the space wolves as the very dunes they walked upon became a morass of shifting mud prone to slide at any moment. Now caught in difficult terrain, Needletongue's forces revealed themselves as demonic cavalry raced around them from all sides. The space wolves responded instantly, but to their surprise, their bolters hit only air. Mocking laughter rang out as many of the phantasm riders were revealed to be mere illusions, though not all. Lashing tongues and whips began to ensnare Astaroutes and yank them out from the safety of their ranks, trampled beneath the razor-sharp hooves of the demonic steeds or slashed to ribbons by the daemonettes riding the beasts. Larger daemon engines rolled over the crests of dunes, their wheels thundering like the discordant echoes of the storms booming overhead as they rode over entire squadrons of marines, chariot blades slicing through ceramite like paper. In the distance, the daemon prince Needletongue posed atop a desecrated statue, a tentacled abomination clambering over the crumbling masonry. Six-skinned wolf head snapped from its waist beneath an androgynous torso waving a daemon sword as it ordered its forces to destroy the space wolves. However, the sons of Rus were far from helpless. The air was filled with the roar of chain swords and hum of power weapons as they slashed at their demonic tormentors, cutting down dozens of squealing daemonettes. Well-thrown grenades overturned chariots as they passed by, sending their riders tumbling into the dust where they were hacked to shreds by vengeful Astaroutes. Dragongaze proved why he was Jarl, his frost axe Wormclaw singing in harmony to the furious bellows of its wielder who roared with every daemon he cut down. At his side were the herdmen, his personal retinue of bodyguards who cut down any who attempted to bar their master's path, and soon Dragongaze and his men stood before Needletongue. The Daemon Prince and the Jarl wasted no time as they hurled themselves at each other, a furious melee in which there could be only one survivor. Time and time again Maligen-Yl's tentacles lashed out, seeking to knock Crom off his feet or send his bodyguards flying away. The Daemon Prince's sword hummed with dark magics, and with each strike, the protective runes on the Jarl's armor glowed with renewed might, seeking to dispel the foul curses that would have laid any lesser man low. All around them, space wolves and daemons were locked in fierce duels, matching implacable fury against quicksilver swiftness in a battle that was rapidly reaching its climax. One after another, the Jarl's bodyguards lopped off the snarling wolf heads, while Crom himself let out a renewed burst of fury that sent the daemon's sword, along with its wrist, tumbling into the dust, where it was soon followed by Needletongue's leering head. Chapter 2, The Doom of the High King. As impressive as it was, the Drakeslayer's swift victory upon Valdramani soon proved to be merely the opening movement in a symphony whose parts were even now unfolding across the rest of the Fenris system. Upon the ocean-covered moon of Svelgard, a regiment of the famed Elysian drop troops responded to the High King's call for aid, eager to pay off a debt owed for 5 centuries. Tumbling down through cold grey skies toward rapidly reddening ocean tides, the Imperial Guard leapt from their Valkyries to begin what was known as Fire Mark -2, clashing with the forces of the second prince of the Infernal Tetrad, the daemon known as Arkgar. From the moment they materialized, the former Blood Angel and his key ornate brutes were right where they wanted to be, at the heart of a bloody battle. Atop the gore-slicked decks of commandeered barges, rows of skull cannons fired their demonic flak into the air at the men of the Imperial Guard who vainly strove to halt their rampage. Most were torn into bloody pieces either before or shortly after they landed on the blood-slicked decks of Arkgar's fleet, but enough were making it through to entertain the brutish Daemon Prince. Fire Mark -2 also encompassed the bizarre actions of the third member of the Infernal Tetrad, the Daemon Prince known as Tsanchar. As expected from a servant of the Architect of Fate, Tsanchar objectives were as convoluted as they were mysterious, erupting from a warp rift to begin a ritual around Morkai's Keep, a 6th Legion bastion on the ice world of Frostheim. Treachery from within saw the daemons and their mortal thralls quickly take control of the bastion, though not before calls for aid were sent out. However, this had been accounted for in the labyrinthine schemes of Tsanchar, and thus rather than nearby Fenris, these distress calls were twisted and rerouted to a far less friendly recipient. The consequences of Tsanchar's actions would not be evident for some time though, nor could forces be spared as of yet to halt their incursion, and so the uncaring sands of time continued their countdown, progressing to Fire Mark -1. Back on Fenris, when the Harfylker learned of the demonic taint defiling the worlds under his protection, his wrath was fearsome indeed. Though there were but a few Svate present on Fenris, Grimnir had no shortage of volunteers willing to join his expedition to Midgardia. Gathering his men, the High King of Fenris set out to defend his land, accompanied with just over 300 loyal retainers, including the mighty Thanegel Jarnulfr. Their journey was short, and soon the Space Wolves had landed in force. One of 3 inhabited worlds in the Fenris system, Midgardia was in many ways the opposite of Fenris. Thick, lush jungles covered its surface, a poisonous greenhouse home to all manner of toxic plant life and fearsome beasts. As such, most of the world's 6.5 billion inhabitants lived just below the crust in inverted hives. Though its people could not join the Legion, their population was sufficient to contribute to the Astra Militarum, as well as a robust planetary defense force. In addition, a chapter house of the Valkyria made its home there, serving as a vital training ground for nearly 1,000 sisters of Fenris who were taught off-world survival as well as leadership. Thus it was to their convent, the Abbey of the Emperor's Judgment, that Grimnir and his men made for after they landed, for it was situated directly below a vast Nova Cannon array of the same name. However, as they descended through the jungles toward the hive lift complex that would take them below the surface, the Space Wolves found themselves under attack. Lurching out from noxious clouds of acidic mist, the rotting tide of flesh of a host of plague-bearers hurled themselves at the armored treads of Grimnir's column. Any other foe would have been stunned by the stench of these demonic abominations, but the Space Wolves had been forewarned to expect the Neverborn, and thus reacted instantly. As one, the gunners sighted their pintle-mounted storm bolters, opening up a withering fusillade into the putrid mists, and were rewarded with renewed groans from the Nurglite daemons. Only marginally slower, the sponsons of each of the Space Wolves' mighty land raiders rotated, putting their companions' shots to shame with the sheer volume of death spat out by their hurricane bolters. Before long, Grimnir's armored column was surrounded by hundreds of splintered and shattered trees on all sides. Even the mists had blown back from the amount of firepower the Harfylker had unleashed, revealing the oozing bodies of countless lesser daemons. Yet still the servants of the Plague God came on, groaning and ringing sonorous bells as they marched ever closer to the Astaroth's forces. However, Grimnir and his men were not about to stop and confront them. Knowing his true foe lay beneath the surface, the High King ordered his column to keep moving forward at any cost. The mighty armored treads of Grimnir's personal transport, the land raider Wrath of Mjolnir, ground dozens of daemons into the soil as it pushed onward, its hellfrost cannons blasting giggling piles of Nurglings into sludge. In his wake, the rest of the Space Wolves' forces pressed forward, an honor guard protecting the advance of their High King. The Plague Legions closed in from every direction, clambering out of the ground itself in order to clog the treads of rhinos. Droning rot flies swarmed down out of the skies, plucking unlucky legionaries who had made the mistake of leaning too far out of hatches. Rusty blades wielded by towering rotting cyclops plunged into the bodies of dozens of Astaroths, seemingly feeling no pain no matter how many chunks of flesh were lopped off and returned by chainswords. More than one brave son of Rust disappeared beneath piles of chortling Nurglings, their death marked only by the rapid-fire thump of their grenades going off. Still Grimnir and his companions pressed on, knowing that the true fight still lay ahead beneath the surface. Soon enough, the Space Wolves made it to their destination, driving their tanks and transports directly into the industrial elevators meant to haul cargo beneath the surface. Descending into the depths, Grimnir spoke to his men, rallying their spirits with a rousing speech. The elevators came to a jarring stop, and the doors retracted upward, revealing the clinical, sterile environment of the Abbey's sub-level garages. Though they had feared the worst, Grimner was enthused to see his arrival was expected, and he quickly disembarked to meet with the Sororitas who were waiting for him. Reaching out an armored gauntlet that was dwarfed by Grimner's massive fist, Canonis Preceptor Ingrid quickly explained the situation to the High King. Canonis Preceptor Ingrid Hrafnkelsdottir. A native of Fenris, the saga of Ingrid Hrafnkelsdottir is a tale of a meteoric rise and fall. Once merely a young tribal shield maiden, Ingrid's life was changed forever when she received a vision of the Emperor in the midst of a grueling labor. Though her child was lost, the story of how obstinately she clung to life made its way to a nearby convent of the Valkyria, who took her in. Ingrid's spirit remained undiminished no matter how many penances she was assigned by the mistress of the novices, and it was that same spirit which saw her rapidly rise through the ranks to become Prioress Astrid's right hand. However, the Canonis Preceptor has made more than a few enemies upon Ophelia 7 due to her prickly nature, lashing out with a fiery temper to express her rather heterodox views regarding the Alfather's divine nature to all who would listen. Thus she has spent the better part of the last 30 years below the surface of Midgardia, cast far from the honored halls a woman of her talent would otherwise have roamed. As expected, the battle for Midgardia was not going well. Several of the subterranean hives had already fallen, rotted from the inside out by the presence of the demonic legions. Leading the warband was a powerful daemon prince of Nurgle, Morduk the Rotted, the fourth and final commander of the infernal tetrad. Many brave sisters had been lost attempting to bring this fiend to justice, but with Grimner and his champions present, they now stood a fighting chance. Accompanied by Thanjar Nulfr, along with his personal bodyguards and the prioress herself, Grimner descended into the depths of the abbey, where the daemons of Nurgle had been fighting to escape the lowest reaches. Meanwhile, the remaining space wolves took their place alongside the rest of the convent, fighting side by side in grueling zone mortalis battles to clear the hab blocks of the hive from demonic filth. Being built entirely underground, the Abbey of the Emperor's Judgment was constructed in reverse of those convents built on the surface. Thus rather than basements or larders, the lowest reaches of the abbey was the colossal bell tower, whose windows revealed the vast caverns of Midgardia that the convent and all the other hives were built in. Far in the distance, explosions made bright by the relative darkness of the cave system lit up the void in brief flashes of light, illuminating the constant rockfall as vast chunks of masonry sloughed off the hives. Down and down into the depths they plunged, descending hundreds of meters into rivers of molten magma, whose geothermal energy provided the power necessary to power the vast subterranean industries. However, the space wolves had little time to sightsee, for the halls of the bell tower were a charnel house. Dozens of sororitas lay strewn about the floor, their bodies mangled and hacked into dozens of pieces. Blood and gore coated nearly every surface, and as the High King watched, more of it was splattered as the armored form of Prioress Astrid, the venerable Valkyria who was in charge of the entire abbey, was bisected by a whirling mower of rusted blades wielded by a grinning monstrosity. As Grimner and his companions emerged at the lowest reaches of the abbey, it was by chance or fate that they arrived to witness the death of Mother Prioress Astrid at the hands of Morduk the Rotted, Daemon Prince of Nurgle. A Daemon Prince of the infernal tetrad, this particular Neverborn was a towering brute of livid flesh and oozing pestilence, his rusted helm bisecting horizontally to reveal a fanged maw which barked out foul laughter at the enraged screams of the Valkyria reinforcements accompanying Grimner. Before the High King could say otherwise, the sisters unleashed a hail of bolter fire. Morduk however was undaunted, the stinging pain of bullet wounds swiftly fading as the blessings of his foul patron took effect. As the Daemon Prince waved his rusted axe in the air, the Daemon's allies responded to the new arrivals, lurching toward the elevator, intent on slaughtering the Valkyria just as they had their companions before them. Unfortunately for the Neverborn, the sororitas were not alone. Fearsome howls that made even the daemons hesitate as the space wolves leapt into action, hip-firing their bolters into the heaving masses of Neverborn filth. Chain swords roared and power swords hissed as they lopped off rotting limbs and cyclopean horned heads. The battle quickly devolved into a tangled melee, Astaroths and Valkyria slaughtering and being slaughtered in turn by the Nurglite host. In the center of it all, Logan Grimner faced off against the towering monstrosity that was Morduk, accompanied only by Canonis Ingrid and Thanjar Nulfr. Their bodyguards had been separated in the brawl, bogged down in their own individual duels amidst a heaving sea of rotting green and brown. The High King was death incarnate, every blow lopping off chunks of diseased flesh. The axe of Mordecai sang as he swung it through the air, lighter than usual as the putrid blood of a rival Daemon Prince flowed from his every strike. Thenjar Nulfer gave almost as good an account, his lightning claws crackling as they hacked down clouds of plague flies that the Daemon Prince vomited forth. The Canonis commander was of equal skill, her plasma pistol spitting molten death at the plague-bearers who sought to interrupt the duel of the Daemon Prince and the High King. The tide began to turn, and soon the demonic hosts began to recede, driven from the bell tower by the fury of Grimnir and his companions. However, as the decaying mountain of Mordecai's form fell to the ground, his essence unraveling from dozens of wounds, he did not curse or rage as one might have expected. Rather, the rotted began to laugh, his eyeless face swiveling to behold the space wolves and Valkyria gathering to watch Grimnir behead him. Before the High King could swing his axe, a colossal series of explosions began to ring out. A shuddering, deafening noise filled the air as countless tons of masonry began to rain down, and Grimnir staggered as the bell tower split in two. Now detached from its anchor, Grimnir, his bodyguard, and the rapidly decaying corpse of the vanquished Daemon Prince were sent plummeting into the depths of Midgardia's caverns. Simultaneously, in the void above, Grimnir's flagship, Alfathar's Honor, lost all contact with its forces on the ground. As the High King vanished from sight, command of the Space Wolves fell to Thenjar Nulfer. While he focused on mopping up the remaining daemons with the assistance of Canonis Ingrid and her sisters, the loyal captain called upon his best scouts and trackers to descend into the depths of Midgardia's hives in order to find the Harfylker, or at least, evidence he was no longer in the land of the living. Deeper and deeper did the Space Wolves' outriders descend, fighting off pestilent horrors of all descriptions, from segmented plague WYRMS the size of a mag train, to flights of glitch flies that played havoc with their armor and sensors. Even as their tracking equipment sputtered and gave out, the Sons of Rus continued their hunt, their loyalty to Grimnir undaunted. However, all they found was the king's crown, Grimnir's ancient helmet carved with the runes of every Harfylker to have ever ruled the route. Chapter 3, The Falsehoods of Frostheim. Now after many centuries and even more plots, the doom of the Sixth Legion was now finally coming to fruition. The ensnarement of the hated Space Wolves, 9 millennia in the making, had gone off perfectly, the culmination of 9 times 9 schemes. The 4 Daemon Princes of the Infernal Tetrad had brought slaughter and change to the worlds of the Fenris system, each unleashing a different choir of the Neverborn in service to a dark bargain made with the servants of the Changer of Ways. The machinations of Tzeentch had ensnared numberless hosts to his cause, both knowingly and unknowingly pawns in a greater game. Many shards of the multifaceted mind of the Architect of Fate were riveted upon this one vital system, for it was key to many schemes going forward and backwards. The Magi stir of destinies had ensured all was unfolding just as planned, for even now, one of his most potent servants lurked, waiting to be quite literally called upon. Changeling. Even amongst the other servants of the Lord of Lies, the horror known as the Changeling is among the most deceitful beings in existence. A master shapeshifter, the Changeling has altered its features so many times that not even it remembers its original appearance, something only Tzeentch himself recalls. The Changeling has proved instrumental in many of the Architect of Fate's most effective schemes, from serious plots such as the damnation of Magnus the Red, to practical jokes upon the other ruinous powers. As one servant to another, Ahriman has made a bargain to enlist the Changeling in service of his own schemes, but the Osirian Dreadnought Lord remains wary, for the Changeling always has its own plots as well. Using its skill as a master deceiver, the Changeling had assumed the shape of a Raven Guard scout. Many years before the invasion of the Fenris system, the false scout had brought the Asteroutes of the 19th to the point of open conflict with a band of space wolves. The secretive Sons of Rus refused to tell the Sons of Deliverance what they were doing on the hive world of New Raids, and after they fled the surface, a massive daemon incursion erupted, preventing the Raven Guard from pursuing. Such was its magnitude that the Grey Knights had to intervene, and though they survived, the strange occurrence had done much to convince the suspicious scions of the Shade Lord that the Space Wolves were somehow responsible. The Grey Knights also began to suspect their longtime ally of concealing something after discovering the mutated corpses of 6th Legion Asteroutes on multiple worlds in the wake of daemon invasions. This pattern of escalating suspicions had continued for over a decade, the Changeling changing faces as it saw fit in order to bring the suspicion of the Space Wolves up to a fever pitch. Now, As the never-born armies of the infernal Tetrad marched upon the worlds of the Fenris system, the Changeling had found its way aboard a vessel of the Inquisition operating in a nearby sector. In place of an Asterutes, the daemon now wore the face of an unassuming mortal, a man known as Vox Senes Chalmend Axis. In this guise, the Changeling knew and controlled every scrap of classified information, from Vox transmissions to astropathic relays. Thus it was perfectly in position to act when the Inquisition received an unexpected distress call from Frostheim, quickly routing it to the attention of the Inquisition. His attention piqued by the news of a demonic incursion, the formidable Inquisitor Banis de Mornay of the Ordo Hereticus recognized a threat when he saw one. Though the presence of daemons generally fell under the purview of the Ordo Malleus, de Mornay knew to delay would risk the loss of Frostheim. To one such as the veteran Inquisitor de Mornay, the chance to investigate the Fenris system was far too tempting to pass up. However, the Legion's Asterutes had never been that willing to acquiesce to the demands of outsiders, even ones as powerful as the Inquisition, and thus de Mornay knew he would need reinforcements. As fate would have it, de Mornay's call for reinforcements was answered by none other than Inquisitor Lord Fyodor Karamazov. Having long suspected the Space Wolves of deviancy, Karamazov was quick to throw his authority around to gather up a suitable force to bend the 6th Legion to his will. Just as planned, forces bound for the Kadayan Gate were in just the right place to be bent to Karamazov's designs. Fresh from vanquishing the greater daemon Mkakin on the fortress world of Long Hallow, a fleet of silver-hulled warships lined with engrammatic wards came, led by the august figure of Grand Master Valdar Orican and his third brotherhood of the mighty Grey Knights. From the far southern rim, a murder fleet of Raven Guard warships silently joined Karamazov's muster, their commander brusquely announcing himself as Shadow Captain Arderic Vons. Dozens of Imperial Navy vessels trickled in from all vectors, from small Cobra-class destroyers to mighty Avenger-class Grand Cruisers, carrying enough ordnance to level a star system. Inside their armored hulls, the 18th Regiment of Valhallan Ice Warriors led by Commander Kubrick Chinkov readied themselves for battle. Chinkov's reputation for unflagging determination spoke for itself, and the Ice Worlders under his command would be invaluable on the frozen death world of Fenris. Such fanatic devotion found its equal in the 3 commanderies of the Sisters of the Order of the Divine Lamentation, for the Adeptus Auroritas were always willing to answer the call of the Ordo Hereticus. All this and more came to Karamazov's summons, the Inquisitor Lord calling in every favor and debt to muster a force capable of bringing a legion to heel, for that was exactly what he intended to do. Though such an armada was no doubt desperately needed at the Kadayan Gate and elsewhere, Karamazov and his allies were certain the threat presented by the Space Wolves was too great to ignore. If the 6th Legion had spurned their oaths, as the Pyrophant Judge of Salem Proctor already believed, they needed to be removed before the destroyer's forces made their move. Karamazov's conviction was unimpeachable, wholly without guile or doubt as he laid out his evidence and reasoning for striking at the Space Wolves now, and thus despite their misgivings, Grand Master Orican and his 2 lieutenants, Brother Captains Stern and Voldus, assented to his plan. For his part, Shadow Captain Vons needed no convincing. He himself had nearly been declared excommunicate mortis several decades before for reasons that had been swiftly covered up, and was thus eager to win the favor of the Inquisition by supporting their efforts. Little did Karamazov and his allies know that they needn't have worried, for such a force was more than enough to shatter the defenses of Fenris. Already, most of the 6th Legion were deployed elsewhere, defending other worlds of the Imperium against forces of the ruinous powers, precursors to an impending 13th Black Crusade. Attacks spearheaded by the Sorcerer Lords of the Thousand Suns had stretched the Space Wolves far from their home, a choice that was no choice at all, which had rendered the Fenris system vulnerable to the demonic incursions now orchestrated into position. Now the final assault was beginning to unfold, a series of blows whose first strikes were carried out by those who should have been the 6th Legion's allies, as well as directly, for the proud sorcerers of Sorcerias would not permit any others to strike the killing blow to their hated rivals. First to arrive in the Fenris system were the forces of Inquisitor de Mornay. Tasked by Karamazov to be his herald, de Mornay's flotilla had swiftly sailed through the warp, their small numbers able to sail much more quickly than the ponderous bulk of the Imperial Navy fleet accompanying Karamazov's own detachment. Vox Senes Chalmend Axis was quick to relay repeated distress calls from Frostheim to de Mornay's attention, and thus rather than wait for Karamazov or establish communications with Fenris itself, de Mornay ordered his forces to make landfall. None dared gainsay his decision, for even from space, the corruption of Frostheim was plain to see. Once covered in pristine blue-gray glaciers, Frostheim was now wreathed in warp fire courtesy of the infernal Tetrad's foul ministrations. Flocks of Tsiantian daemon roamed the surface, screamers and flamers alike pouring out of warp rifts to burn blackened streaks in ritualistic patterns across entire continents. As the ice melted away, a landscape of ancient bone was revealed, ridges and valleys forming a grotesque symbol of the warp whose heart was a single tainted source, the fortress of Morkai's Keep. Once a mighty bastion, Morkai's Keep had been reshaped from the ground up into a twisted mockery of the Fang in miniature. This foul parody extended to its defenders, for patrolling its twisted battlements was a warband of Chaos Space Marines known as the Dagger Fangs, ready to repel any would-be invaders. Tsanchar had taken great delight in corrupting the leader of these heretic Astaroths, a Chaos Lord by the name of Vicus Scale, wrapping him, his chaplain-turned-dark apostle Hicastus Null and his legionaries in a magical glamour that made them appear to be corrupted sons of Rus, though the Dagger Fangs themselves were unable to perceive it. Thus as de Mornay's forces began to land, they soon reported coming under attack by the Space Wolves. A punishing fusillade of automated defenses tore one dropship after another out of the sky, forcing the Imperial forces to assault the keep on foot. Utterly convinced by this deception, de Mornay ordered his armies to take Frostheim at any cost. Joined by Shadow Captain Vons as well as Grand Master Orican, de Mornay led his men from the front, pushing through the freezing blizzards which seemed to have a mind of their own. However, sub-zero temperatures were not enough to deter the fanatic Inquisitor, and his Astaroth's allies did not feel the cold, insulated as they were in their power armor. Long renowned for their mastery of stealth, the Raven Guard led the way, utilizing the blizzards to advance undetected until they were within a kilometer of the keep. The Dagger Fangs were caught completely by surprise as a withering blast of plasma struck their corrupted fortress, most of it aimed at the thick adamantium doors. Multiple Devastator squads of Raven Guard rose up from drifts of snow to unleash blazing payloads into their target, and such was their fervor that more than one legionary was forced to discard their overheated weapon after their mighty salvo. However, as the steam cleared, the mighty doors still stood firm, the telltale shimmer of Source Rouse shields revealing how they had survived such molten fury. Now alerted, the Dagger Fangs struck back as their own heavy weapons teams unleashed a withering fusillade from atop the battlements. A dozen tactical marines were blasted into twisted chunks of gore and metal as crack missiles and autocannons tore through their armor. Atop the tallest tower, a sorcerer chanted a foul ritual, intending to send a bolt of lightning into the tanks at the heart of the Loyalist column, but to his astonishment, his incantations yielded nothing. The source of this discrepancy was soon revealed, for with a blinding white light, an entire company of Grey Knights manifested upon the battlefield, using their teleporters to shunt up just under the walls of the keep. Led by Grand Master Orican himself, a trio of mighty Nemesis Dread Knights marched toward Morkai's Keep, their mighty exoskeletons protected by powerful force shields. As the Grand Master used his prodigious psychic ability to negate the sorcerer's spells, the other two unleashed a withering hail of bolter fire that erupted from the Gatling silencers and heavy psychonons mounted on each of their arms. The powerful Psybolt ammunition, infused with the Emperor's holy wrath, made short work of the Source Rouse incantations protecting the gate, and soon the mighty doors tumbled down, blasted open by force. Raising his mighty hammer in triumph, the Grand Master led his brethren in a grand charge against the walls of the keep, swiftly smashing through the Source Rouse wards using his mighty nemesis Daemon Griatomar. As the walls came tumbling down, they crushed a generator, sending a roaring explosion in every direction. A hail of shrapnel sliced gashes into the invaders and defenders alike, wounding dozens, but it quickly became the least of the Dagger Fang's concerns. Orican's companions, a redoubtable paladin squad, quickly cut down a room full of what they saw as corrupted space wolves. However, their foes were anything but idle, and the Chaos Space Marines quickly responded to maintain their corrupt grip upon Morkai's Keep. What had initially seemed an unstoppable charge was quickly revealed as a false hope as the traitors sought to stymie their foes at the source of the breach. Dozens of weapons emplacements began to open up upon the advancing Imperial forces, heavy bolter arrays sending the Loyalists diving for cover. At the same time, half a dozen missile silos swiveled toward the true threat, the Nemesis Dread Knights. The mighty walkers had almost no time to react as their force shields lit up beneath a withering round of fire. Even their mighty wards could not repel firepower of that magnitude, and with a groan and a sputter, their ancient mechanisms gave out, just in time for ruby-beamed las cannons to slice through their true silver armor. As the twin walkers tumbled to the debris-choked ground alongside the bodies of a score of Astaroths unlucky enough to be standing beside them, the traitors continued to unleash destruction. From behind vast curtain walls, the Baroque majesty of a Spartan tank maneuvered into position, leveling its las cannon arrays at the towering figure of the remaining Dread Knight armor. However, forewarned of this impending doom by the death of his brethren, Grand Master Orican was quick to act, sending a psychic pulse to activate an ancient relic known as the Sigil of Exigence. The venerable Cha bronze icon lit up in response, spiriting him away in a blaze of light to reappear across the battlefield to press the assault elsewhere. In Orican's absence, his allies continued to press on. Atop the fortress, assault marines equipped with jump packs flew toward the battlements, moving to engage a swarm of Skikklaws in the air led by Hecastus Null. The Dark Apostle laughed with malicious glee as he further blackened the sable armor of the Raven Guard, sending them plummeting back down to the ground as he blasted searing holes in them with the burning fury of his relic plasma pistol. Down below, the Paladins had met a worthy foe as they battled against a squadron of assault Terminators, the corridors ringing with the boom of thunder hammers and the crackling of lightning claws. However, the demonic fury of the dagger fangs could not overcome the true silver armor of the Paladins, and the Daemon Hunters eventually gained the upper hand, though at grievous cost to their own numbers. The battle tipped back and forth, the two sides clashing for dominance in a fierce struggle. One by one, the towers of Morkai's Keep came tumbling down, brought low by carefully placed melta charges. At the base of the walls, a mighty Terrax assault drill had emerged from the ground, drilling another gaping hole that brought many tons of masonry tumbling down. Caught in one of these unlucky collapses, Orican began to take wounds, surrounded by dozens of nigh suicidal dagger fangs, who sought the glory of claiming the Grand Master's head. This mighty servant of the throne took dozens of wounds, his mighty war suit crippled by well-placed shots and blows, and might have perished, brought low by the tide of traitors. Only the sudden arrival of a squad of Terminators, focusing their psychic might to punch a corridor through the Immaterium in order to cross to his side, saved his life. Together they repelled the assault before falling back in good order. Unwilling to let such their quarry away so easily, the Dagger Fangs attempted to respond, unleashing a Storm Wolf dropship that raced toward the center of the Imperial lines, guided by Tsunchar's Source Rouse foresight. However, their assault quickly proved to be premature, for they had not reckoned with the rest of the Imperial forces. As the Storm Wolf dropship roared overhead, the Raven Guard quickly responded to this incursion, Devastator squads opening up once more to blast the impudent craft out of the sky with a hail of flak missiles. Roars of fury erupted from the shattered craft as a squad of traitor Astaroths tumbled out. Most landed on their feet, though not all, beginning to charge toward the heart of the Imperial forces in what was clearly a decapitation strike. The Sons of Deliverance, always ready to pick on a weakened foe, converged on this new enemy, bolters blasting away at targets that proved much softer than the mighty walls of Morkai's Keep. Soon only one traitor remained, Vicus Scale himself. Shielded by his corrupted iron halo and the incantations of Tsunchar, Scale tore through an entire squad of Raven Guard by himself, a one-man rampage pressing ever closer to Inquisitor de Mornay. The Inquisitor of the Ordo Hereticus was riding atop a towering warsoot, a primitive walker designed in obsequious imitation of his master Karamazov's own infamous Throne of Judgment. However, de Mornay's suit was far less powerful than the original, and blessed by Tsunchar's favor, Scale's power axe quickly hacked it down. De Mornay attempted to meet the heretic Astaroths in hand-to-hand combat, but was just as quickly torn to pieces in a display that might have pleased the blood god were Scale not a servant of his rival, the Changer of Ways. Pleased by the culmination of his plans, Tsunchar plucked his servant from the battle, taking him and a few chosen dagger fangs back to his side before vanishing from Frostheim. Dark Apostle Hecastus Null was not among these, left to his fate as he was cut to ribbons by a dozen nemesis halberds. As his lifeless body fell to the ground, it was joined by the battered walls of Morkai's Keep as they finally came tumbling down. As the Imperial forces destroyed the remaining daemons of Tsiench present on Frostheim, they were confronted by what appeared to them to be the ugly truth of the Space Wolves' treachery. As the surviving Imperial commanders gathered together, sans the deceased Inquisitor, they began to discuss their next objective. Shadow Captain Vons, who had spent most of the battle assaulting the walls inside his Terrax transport, advocated for a strike upon Fenris itself, to bring the fight to the home of the Space Wolves. However, Grand Master Orikan did not agree. While it seemed obvious that the Space Wolves, at least some of them, had embraced chaos, the mighty seer was not the master of the Liberius for nothing. His instincts told him something was amiss, for why would the traitors attack the relatively worthless world of Frostheim? Overruling the bloodthirsty Vons, Orikan ordered his forces to return to the Mandeville Point and await Karamazov and the rest of the fleet's arrival. Vons attempted to argue, but when he saw the Grand Master's mind was made up, he was forced to assent. However, what neither Orikan nor Vons knew was their battle had not gone unnoticed. Like a puppet master readying the strings of his marionettes, Ahriman had watched the Battle of Frostheim, and found himself well pleased. The Chosen of Tsianch had seated agents across dozens of Imperial naval vessels gathering in the Fenris system, softly whispering treacheries and suspicions in the dreams of mortals. Tsianchar's minions had set the stage for the next chapter of the doom of the Space Wolves, but such a story required the right audience. Across the towering walls of Morkai's keep, automated sentries had recorded the harrowing duel between Inquisitor de Mornay and the Chaos Lord of the Dagger Fangs, of the combat between loyal and heretic Astaroths, and dutifully broadcast them across the system. From his position at the comms station, Vox Sene's Chalmend Axis was precisely positioned to intercept these routine transmissions. The favored servant of the Lord of Lies set to work, seeding the recordings with a scrap code virus, twisting the images to suit its dark designs. Once its foul machinations had been completed, Mendaxis sent them on their way to Lord Inquisitor Karamazov and the Imperial Navy captains gathered at his side. However, the story they now told had been twisted with deceit, though like all good lies, it was based in truth. Picked captures presented the demonic threats present across the Fenris system, including those on Frostheim, but rather than heretic Astaroths, Karamazov and his men watched de Mornay's forces battling against what appeared to be the Space Wolves themselves. Any doubts of the 6th Legion's innocence now vanished from Karamazov's allies. With such damning evidence visible to all, the Lord Inquisitor was free to enact the ultimate sanction. The treacherous Space Wolves have now finally been revealed for what they are. In the dark days of the Leonine Heresy, the beloved First Found War Master declared the 6th Legion to be renegades. Yet somehow these servants of darkness managed to escape their rightful judgment. Well, no more. Loyal sons and daughters of Terra, I call upon you now to strike down upon these heretics with great vengeance. Lay waste to their daemon-corrupted worlds, topple their blasphemous works, and reclaim this system in the name of the God Emperor. Lord Inquisitor Fyodor Karamazov. Chapter 4, The Judgment of Midgardia. Unaware of the deception perpetrated upon them, the armies of the Inquisition and their allies now marked the Space Wolves as enemies upon their friend or foe identifiers. The princes of the Infernal Tetrad had played their parts, and with the Space Wolves now occupied across the Fenris system, their home world itself was as undefended as it ever would be. Their oiling seas of the Immaterium heaved with fresh swells of madness created by the carnage that had been unleashed upon the Fenris system, from the blood-soaked oceans of Svelgard to the barren dunes of Valdramani, of the burial of High King Grimnir and the treacherous deceit perpetrated on Frostheim. The paranoia and suspicion of the Imperium had now been turned upon the Space Wolves once more, an ironic re-echo of 10 millennia past. Like a towering meteorite hurtling into an atmosphere, the Imperial Retribution fleet intruding into the Fenris system began to slough off in every direction as it made for the system's heart. As more distress calls rolled in, the vast armada began to split, bringing their forces to bear against the daemon incursions still clinging on to wherever they could find purchase. Soon only the forces directly under Karamazov remained at his side as the High Inquisitor attempted to establish contact with the Fang. The Pyrophant Judge of Salem Proctor had never been known for his patience, and he wasted no time in accusing the sons of Rus of everything from heresy to blasphemy to witchcraft. Amidst these frantic accusations were demands High King Grimnir surrender himself and turn over the Fang to be inspected by the Inquisition for deviancy. However, after several hours of silence, the fortress monastery of the Space Wolves finally deigned to reply. The Lord Inquisitor found himself confronted by an ancient Astaroths whose snow-white beard rivaled his own. Ulrich the Slayer, chief priest of the Speakers of the Dead, denounced Karamazov's allegations in no uncertain terms, rebutting his arguments with a barrage of thinly veiled insults. The two seemed on the verge of declaring war right then and there when fate stepped in. Glancing down, Karamazov deigned to respond to his Vox officer, who conveyed the initial reports of Inquisitor de Mornay. Recognizing this as a chance to obtain unassailable proof of Space Wolf's deviancy, the Inquisitor Lord made his move. In a tone that would have cowed any mortal man, Karamazov told the High Priest his reckoning had now arrived. His meeting with the Space Wolves adjourned, the Lord Inquisitor ordered his fleet into action. Their first stop was retrieving the battered forces upon Frostheim, Karamazov listening to the testimony of Grand Master Orican, who confirmed de Mornay's testimony and turned over his shattered remains into the care of the Inquisition. Almost gleeful now, Karamazov ordered his fleet to seize control of Svelgard and Valdramani, as well as begin the landings on Fenris itself. Meanwhile, he himself made for Midgardia, the sole remaining body of any importance, aboard his flagship, Innocentia Nihil Declaret. However, the Lord Inquisitor was unaware that his vessel had been infiltrated, for he had never bothered to learn the identities of his servants, and thus paid no attention to the comms officer manning his station upon the vast bridge. As Karamazov returned to Midgardia, the Imperial Navy fleet began the vast undertaking of landing Fenris itself. Most of the icy death world was a frozen waste, populated only by small villages, and thus the only strategically relevant site upon the home world of the Space Wolves was the Fang. Located at the dead center of Asaheim, the main continent, the famed citadel of the 6th Legion was easy to spot as the tallest peak rising high into the atmosphere from amidst a range of mountains. This mighty fortress had never been completely taken, even by the Thousand Sons during their invasion back in M33, but the fanatic soldiers of the Inquisition were not ones to shirk from a task. Thus they hurled themselves at the Fang from all sides, desperate to carry out Karamazov's orders at any cost. The first and foremost targets of this invasion force were the docking platforms located at the top of the Fang. However, the Space Wolves had learned much from their suffering at the hands of the Thousand Sons, and thus dozens of defensive batteries opened up, blowing countless dropships and aircraft out of the skies. The Inquisition's preliminary bombardment had proven ineffective, as the Fang was protected by mighty void shields, and after sustaining heavy losses attempting to take the landing pads, the Imperial commanders shifted their focus to approaching from the ground. Such was the Fang's diameter, and its position amidst other, lesser peaks, that the invaders could only approach from some of the sides, and so as the Inquisitor's forces pressed closer through pre-sighted bombardment zones, they began to take heavy casualties. However, the Space Wolves, commanded by the venerable Ulrich the Slayer, were not facing just any troops, but zealous hordes determined to destroy them at any cost. Where other armies might have faltered in the cold, the 18th Regiment of the Ice Warriors of Valhalla proved resistant to the frost and snow, marching up the slopes in their endless waves. Commanded by the ruthless Commander Kubrick Chinkov, the Tundra Wolves were led from the front, perched in a commanding position atop one of a spearhead of armored Lehman Russ battle tanks, an irony that was not lost on the Primarchus sons. Dozens of Asteroutes met their end at these tanks named for their gene-sire as they attempted to slow the advance of the Imperial Guard, who seemed impervious to the hundreds of casualties they lost for each meter of ground they took. On another slope, the cold was kept at bay through the judicious use of flamers and meltas, the signature weapons of the Adeptus Sororitas. The Sisters of the Order of the Divine Lamentation were, if possible, even more fanatical than Chinkov, for they utterly despised mutants, a category to them which included Asteroutes. However, their advance was checked not by the mighty Space Marines, but by their own cousins, the Order of the Valkyria. Sororitas fought Sororitas in brutal close quarters, fighting amidst the fiery slopes of the Forge Hills, a tangled snarl of foundries and smithies that provided the Legion with its armaments. This sectarian conflict between the sisters was brutal and merciless, both sides seeing the other as despicable traitors, and there was no mercy given by either side. The only humor to be had amidst this grim sororicide was felt by Then Lucas, the so-called trickster. A perennial rogue, Lucas had been passed from great company to great company over the years, his pranks earning the ire of nearly every Jarl over the years, and it was only his inventive skill in battle that had kept Grimnir from punishing him more severely. Lucas's Svate had not been chosen to accompany any of the Jarls in the missions they had been tasked with by the High King, and as a result he and his chosen band were in the Fang at the time of the Inquisition's invasion. However, it was not for nothing he was reputed as the dirtiest fighter in the Legion, and he fully lived up to his reputation during the invasion. Accompanied by a huge pack of the Legion's aspirants known as Blood Claws, then Lucas moved from battlefield to battlefield, inflicting a heavy toll on the invaders. A dozen of Chinkov's Leman Russes went tumbling into the frozen depths of a lake after Lucas triggered an avalanche in order to cover the icy surface in a layer of snow. A cascading chain reaction of explosions incinerated a dozen squads of Sororitas after the trickster overloaded the Pharetonic furnace controllers. While the armies of the Inquisition struggled to overcome the Fang's outer defenses, the Innocentian Nihil Declarat had arrived at its destination, Midgardia. Unaware of the space wolves deployed under the surface already, the Lord Inquisitor was disgusted as his scanners detected a massive demonic incursion on the surface. Such an invasion would have normally warranted the response of the Grey Knights, but all the Sons of Titan accompanying Karamazov were already deployed elsewhere in the Fenris system. In addition, the Lord Inquisitor had no interest in salvaging what he viewed as a worthless, guilty world. Thus, after confirming the presence of demonic activity on and below the surface, Karamazov ordered Vox Senes Chalmend Axis to broadcast a message to the entire system. "We have arrived, and it is now that we perform our charge. In fealty to the God Emperor, our undying Lord, and by the grace of the Golden Throne, I declare exterminatus upon the imperial world of Midgardia. By the authority of His Imperial Majesty's Holy Inquisition, I, Inquisitor Lord Fyodor Karamazov, hereby sign the death warrant of this tainted world and consign 1 billion souls to oblivion. May imperial justice account in all balance. The Emperor protects." The death of Midgardia was swift and merciless. As the Neverborn infesting the toxic jungle world were Nerglite, a cyclonic torpedo barrage had been chosen in place of the customary virus bombs. The Inquisition rained fire and death upon Midgardia, reducing everything on the surface to thick dunes of ash. 1 million daemons burnt out of existence in the blink of an eye. The resulting quakes wrought significant damage on the hives beneath, sending billions of tons of stone and metal crashing down into the magma below. In the depths, Then Jarnulfur felt these tremors, and quickly recognized them as no natural phenomenon. The bold commander quickly made up his mind, ordering a full retreat back to the surface. While the concept of retreat was alien to the sons of Rus, even the most headstrong among them had no desire to be buried alive. Karamazov's treachery resounded in the warp, where the architect of fate feasted on the sudden change to an entire planet and upon the upswell of hope at those still alive underground who sought to escape the death of their world. This destruction in the Materium, while devastating, was nothing compared to the catastrophe in the warp unleashed by the instant death of so many, the culmination of the first stage of his schemes. Long ago, when the first inklings of the grand plot to lay low the space wolves had been sown, the world of Midgardia had been traded to the grandfather to add into his garden in exchange for the addition of Morduk the Rotted and his putrescent forces to the infernal tetrad. Home to many toxic plants and tropical diseases, Midgardia's fungal-choked hills naturally drew the roomy eye of Nurgle, and thus as Tsiencha's pawns began their invasion, Mordeka's rotting hordes had begun to draw the world of Jungle Planet into the Plaguefather's garden. However, the destruction of Midgardia had now stolen it, and the souls of its people, away from Nurgle's embrace. Once more the architect of lies and his servants had proven false, but it was too late. Morduk and his Neverbornkin had played their part. Who could expect Tsanchar and the other princes of the Tetrad to expend their might to help the Nurglites keep their territory? Tsiencha's eternal rival was thus set back, another masterful play that served as yet one more step in the eternal great game. By this devil's bargain, a great blow had been struck, a betrayal of the highest magnitude that the great conspirator was all too happy to reward. Thus was the next stage of a metaphysical gambit on a scale not seen since the Leonine Heresy unleashed by the confluence of betrayal and deceit. Across the Fenris system, reality began to scream as portals of the damned opened. 9 unholy doorways yawned wide in the cold depths of space, 3 evenly aligned across each of the 3 remaining worlds orbiting the Wolf's Eye. Otherworldly auroras began to fill the skies, providing witch light in skies that were so recently illuminated by the death of Midgardia. The clouds began to rain iridescent drops of liquid mercury that altered the landscape where it fell. At first only minor changes, but ones that began to intensify as more fell. As the ritual neared completion, reality shuddered as colossal silver towers emerged with perfect precision, 1 from each rift to make 9 in total. The enchanted fortresses floated ominously in the skies above geomantic loci, heedless of gravity as etheric lightning crackled around them. The minions of the Great Deceiver poured out across the Fenris system, as the cackling of Tsianch rang out across his court of change. Atop the greatest of the silver towers, a mighty nine-sided replica of long-lost Tiska, the machine eyes of Legion Master Ahriman stared down upon Fenris. It had been centuries, no, millennia since he had last gazed upon this hated world, but he could not leave the next stage of his plans to mere cat's paws. Now was time for the Space Wolves to pay for raising Prospero, and every other plan they had undone over the years. What a pity, Ahriman mused, that the entire 6th Legion was not present. However, that would only make their job that much easier, and would give the Thousand Sons sport hunting them in the years to come. Raising his mechanical fist, Ahriman released a psychic pulse, his synthetic voice carried along etheric currents to all of his myriad forces. The Fenris system burns. The void around the wolves' home world seethes with warp fire. We stand now on the precipice of vindication. Vengeance, justice, at long last. My brothers, we have walked the winding skeins of fate to reach this momentous summit. Some loyal and faithful through the ages, some wayward and treacherous, walking their own paths. But the crimes of the past mean nothing. All paths have led back here. The blade of fate hangs above Fenris. Together we shall drive it deep into the icy earth of that worthless world. These miserable echoes of Leman Russ will face a legion renewed with arcane might. Conclaves of sorcerers will shatter the Fang's battlements. Unending hordes of Flux-blessed Shogal will harvest every soul within its fallen walls. The wolves will break. Fenris will burn. Its seas will boil. And the dogs of Russ will howl over the broken bones of their world's funeral pyre. At long last, my brothers, we will take vengeance for Prospero. As Ahriman finished his speech, the armies of the Thousand Sons and their auxiliaries began their attack. Though the ancient Osirian lord had lost the physical faculties to laugh, the Legion Master let out the closest equivalent his dreadnought sarcophagus would allow, a harsh, dissonant crackle of vox speakers mixed with more than a hint of the demonic. Thus began the doom of Fenris, from which there would be no escape, no reprieve, and no mercy. Warzone, Fenris. A Saga of Spite and Vengeance Part 2. Between the iron gates of fate. The seeds of time were sown. And watered by the deeds of those who know and who are known. Knowledge is a deadly friend. If no one sets the rules. The fate of all mankind, I see, is in the hands of fools. War has come to the Fenris system, home of the mighty space wolves. For millennia, the sons of Russ have protected the galaxy from the nefarious schemes of the Thousand Sons and the forces of chaos. However, suspicion and distrust have turned their allies against them, and now the forces of the Imperium under the command of Lord Inquisitor Fyodor Karamazov seek to bring the wolves to heel. As those who ought to be brothers in arms against the forces of darkness battle amongst themselves, the forces of Ahriman, Osirian Lord of the 15th Legion, have gathered their strength, preparing to destroy the 6th Legion once and for all. The unprepared worlds of the Fenris system have become the targets of chaos like never before as daemons and traitors come to despoil everything they hold dear. Now, with the destruction of Midgardia already accomplished, the rest of the Fenris system hangs in the balance as the Space Wolves, the armies of the Inquisition, and the forces of chaos strive for victory in the grim darkness at the end of the 41st millennium. Chapter 5, The Young Wolf, the Trickster, and the Laughter of Angels. From the heart of a nine-sided spire soaring high above the icy orb of Fenris, the ancient warrior known as Ahriman observed the fires of change spreading the home of his ancient foes, and found himself well pleased. Long had the Osirian dreadnought lord watched with satisfaction as his ancient enemies danced closer to the edge of oblivion with each passing day. All the people of Fenris would suffer, an ironic reversal of Prospero's fate, where the barbarian Russ had struck directly at the head in his assault on ancient Tiska. Now the Thousand Sons would destroy all of Fenris. Threats on all fronts ensured barely 10,000 asteroids were present the moment when warp rifts opened in the Fenris system itself. The product of great sorceries, these portals spewed forth the demonic armies of the Infernal Tetrad, a warband ruled over by 4 daemon princes, one from each choir of the Neverborn, onto worlds of the Fenris system. On the barren moon of Valdramani, daemons of Slaanesh unleashed a carnival excess, while on the water world of Svelgard, the butcher hordes of Kern poured out a red tide in the ocean deeps. Upon the cavern cities hidden beneath the sweltering jungles of Midgardia, pestilent Nurgle sought to claim a new world for his garden, while the treacherous schemes of Tsianch were revealed as heretics and daemons claimed the fortress of Morkai's Keep on the icy wastes of Frostheim. Calls for aid soon echoed out across the system and beyond, and reinforcements on both sides began to pour in as the Space Wolves responded with fury at this desecration of their home. To the defense of Midgardia came High King Grimnir and Thanjar Nulfur. It was there that they battled with the putrid forces of Morduk the Rotted, who sought to claim the underground hives in the name of Nurgle, and it was there the High King fell amidst the lightless caverns, entombed by the final malice of the Daemon Prince even as the Grey Knights and Raven Guard liberated Frostheim. However, what these brave warriors who reclaimed Morkai's Keep did not know was that their battle had been recorded and altered, transmitted to the ships of Inquisitor Lord Fyodor Karamazov, who had mustered his fleets in the outskirts of the Fenris system. The sight of his soldiers dying at the hands of what appeared to be space wolves enraged the Puritan Inquisitor, who pronounced the 6th Legion renegade in accordance with an ancient decree of the original War Master, Horus Lupercal. As Karamazov's forces spread across the Fenris system, the Inquisition unleashed judgment on Midgardia, releasing the dreaded Exterminatus to destroy Midgardia and all that were upon it. From the loyal Imperial soldiers battling to defend their homes to the daemons of Nurgle that they fought, the Lord Inquisitor had judged them one and all to be guilty, renegades and outlaws no longer under Imperial law to be destroyed at any cost. The judgment of Midgardia thus marked the first turning point of the Fenris campaign. The battles were far from over, for fate held moments of great heroism and unmitigated disaster in store for those gathered to witness the devastation of Fenris. Deep below the surface, many of the hives of Midgardia had been sundered by the apocalyptic fury hurled down upon it from the skies, but not all. The mighty void shields of the Nova cannon array located on the northern pole had not been sufficient to protect the powerful guns, but they had stood long enough to ensure the survival of the hives located directly beneath them. Within these few hives that still remained, fierce battles raged as the Imperial forces sought to root out the remaining daemons of Nurgle infesting their home. From their positions inside the Abbey of the Emperor's Judgment, Thanjar Nulfur's forces straggled back above the planetary crust, where they were stunned to witness the aftermath of Karamazov's judgment, which had rendered the surface and everything upon it naught but ash. As Jarnulfur and his men arrived on the surface, they came back into Vox range of their vessel in orbit. Alfathar's Honor was a mighty battleship, but against the assembled might of Karamazov's fleet, they had judged it more prudent to wait for the High King's order before attempting to engage vessels bearing the sigil of the Emperor's Inquisition. However, none had expected Karamazov to lay waste to one of their worlds on his own authority, and the wrath of her captain had been fierce indeed. Coming back around above the now grey surface of Midgardia, Alfathar's Honor unleashed a series of warning shots across the bow of Innocentia Nihil Declared. Their pride affronted, the comparatively tiny vessel had actually fired back, and the two were on the verge of open conflict as Jarnulfur made his way back on the flagship with barely a third of the Asteroutes that had set out to rescue Midgardia. Accompanying them were just as many Sororitas of the Valkyria, many of them nearly catatonic at the loss of their sisters, friends, and their very world. In orbit directly across from the imposing spires of the Alfathar's Honor, Karamazov's temper was beginning to boil. Though his desire to destroy the renegade Asteroutes filled his thoughts, he recognized the tactical deficiency he found himself in. In addition, the destruction of Midgardia was far from complete, for he was aware of the hermetically sealed hives deep below the ashen crust. To allow even a single iota of heresy to remain would be to shirk his duty, but to unleash the second wave would expose his vessel to retaliatory destruction. Thus, in order to overcome this impasse, Karamazov ordered Mendaxis to issue an encrypted transmission summoning his fleet. Always happy to provoke internecine conflict, the false Vox Senes Chal quickly complied with the order, and thus Karamazov settled into his command throne to await his reinforcements. Karamazov's fleet soon responded to his call, and gathered menacingly in the void opposite. As the balance of power shifted firmly in his favor, Karamazov's satisfaction grew in direct proportion. Returning to the bridge, the Lord Inquisitor was on the verge of ordering his fleet to fire upon Midgardia once more, when he found himself interrupted by the return of Brother Captain Arvin Stern, one of Grand Master Oricon's lieutenants. When the venerable Stern arrived on the command deck, Karamazov was astonished and infuriated to see the Grey Knight was accompanied by a space wolf. Looking every inch the tribal savage with his runic totems and his black wolf pelt strewn across his armor, Jarl Ragnar Blackmane gazed impudently up at Karamazov, no hint of fear in his eyes as he beheld the man who sought to destroy his legion. After arriving in the system, Brother Captain Stern's forces had been tasked by the Grand Master to cleanse the Ramles-class star fort in Julnar, which had suffered a demonic incursion at the same time as the rest of the Fenris system. As his forces prepared to land upon the star fort, Stern was contacted by Jarl Blackmane, who had just returned from his years-long hunt for the Oaken Yugr. From warp storm to warp storm he and his great company had traveled, seeking out the lost ones and capturing them to return to Fenris. Though their true purposes had remained concealed from the worlds they saved, Blackmane's exploits in countering demonic incursions had won him great renown. Thus when Jarl Blackmane demanded to accompany the Grey Knights in cleansing them Julnar, Stern had been inclined to listen. The sons of Titan and Fenris thus fought side by side, forging a bond of unity as they delivered the mighty star fort from its invaders. Afterwards, Blackmane's company returned to Fenris to deliver their mysterious cargo, while the Jarl himself accompanied the Grey Knights to Midgardia as a show of trust. However, as they stood upon the bridge, Stern revealed he had not come to plead their case before Karamazov. If the High Inquisitor was correct in his suspicions, the brother captain explained, he would not hesitate to step aside and allow him to judge and execute the Emperor's executioners. Yet even as he vouched for the purity of Blackmane and his men, Stern denounced the company Karamazov kept with stern gravitas. With utter certainty and righteous condemnation, brother Captain Stern pointed an accusing finger at Vox Senes Chalmendaxis, naming him for the daemon that he was. With a piercing screech and the stench of sulfur, the changeling's glamour vanished, its lies torn away with the painful clarity of truth. Infuriated by the loss of its disguise, the horror screamed out a foul curse at its accuser, but its malediction washed off of Stern's warded armor. Blackmane was the next to act, far quicker than the stunned Inquisitor and his bridge crew, who watched helplessly as the Space Wolf riddled the Vox console with rounds from his bolt pistol. However, the daemon was far too protean to be wounded by such a prosaic plan, and the shots changed in midair, transmogrified into as many butterflies. The changeling began to live up to its title, swelling in a billowing cloud of warp energy as another set of blue arms clutching a staff emerged from beneath its long robes. Its face remained hidden, a small mercy for the blight upon sanity that was a daemon of Tziench. The trickster waved its staff, slashing a rent in reality through which spilled a dozen pink horrors, laughing and capering. His initial attack stalled, Ragnar spat, drawing his mighty chain sword and sweeping it through the closest daemon. However, as his blade split the pink horror in two, it let out a cackle. Its bisected flesh began to bubble, and two sullen blue horrors clawed their way out to assail the Jarl. Ragnar slashed these as well, gritting his fangs as horrors split once more, this time into whimsical yellow creatures of flame. The brimstone sprites fled, skipping away from the son of Rus, spitefully hurling magical flames into the nearest consoles. Soon half the room was ablaze, filled with cackling, groaning, and babbling from the menagerie of horrors, who delighted in the kaleidoscope of multicolored smoke and flames as they sought to burn Karamazov's bridge. However, for many of these daemons, their rampage was short-lived. Even as the panicked mortal crew struggled to put out the magical blaze while retaining their sanity, brother Captain Stern was on the move. His storm bolter roared as it unleashed a hail of blessed bolts into the mass of horrors, and his nemesis force sword crackled as it slashed them to ribbons. The Neverborn who perished at the tip of his blade vanished as they fell, prevented from splitting by the Grey Knight's holy aura. As he chanted litanies of detestation, Stern moved methodically across the bridge, undoing the spells of the horrors before putting them down as he pursued the changeling. Noticing its defenders beginning to vanish, the changeling began to hurl spells directly at the Grey Knight, from mutagenic bolts of change to agile flights of screamers that bit and clawed as they wheeled about. Yet the undaunted brother captain refused to slow his march, his ironclad faith in the Emperor protecting him from the daemons who assailed him. Elsewhere, Karamazov's acolytes had joined Ragnar in putting down the horrors, and would soon turn their attention to it. Thus with a mocking laugh, the trickster waved its avian-tipped staff, and began to fold in on itself. As Stern swiped his blade toward it, the last of the daemon vanished from reality, teleporting away to the realms of madness once more. Though none who were not present would have dared believe it, the changeling's assault had managed to render Fyodor Karamazov momentarily abashed. However, his expression had quickly assumed its customary scowl of repugnance, and it was this aspect that was evident as he spoke with Stern and Blackmane. Though he was not willing to give up his quest to bring the Space Wolves to justice, the Lord Inquisitor was practical enough to shelf it for the time being, until the daemons had been purged from Fenris and order restored. As chaos reigned upon the Lord Inquisitor's bridge, the space wolves were far from idle. It was Thenjarnulfr who recognized the precipice his legion stood upon at this moment. To destroy Karamazov's vessel would bring the space wolves into open war against the Inquisition, a decision with unimaginable consequences. Such a choice was the duty of Jarls and Harfylkers, not a simple Then such as he. However, there was precious little time, and thus Jarnulfr made his choice. While the two Voidcraft stood with their guns armed and aimed at each other, the Then descended into the depths of Alfathar's honor, making for the quarters of the Rune Priests. Consulting with the wise ancients, Jarnulfr explained his plan to find the missing High King. The Gotha seemed doubtful that such a thing would work, but in lieu of a better plan, they agreed to lend their aid. Thus the Then and the Rune Priests hurried to the ship's teleporter Iomare, where they were joined by the Iron Priests. Though he himself was no psyker, Jarnulfr had a way of working with machine spirits, and had nearly become an Iron Priest. Despite the situation, the Then could not help but be fascinated by the team of Iron Priests slowly and painstakingly working their ritual, offering up oil and amber as they coaxed the irascible machine spirit of the king's crown to the fore. As they did so, the Rune Priests sought to connect the silver threads between the broken helm and its master, between it and the rest of the ancient armor that hopefully still protected the High King, wherever he may be. After many tense minutes, the ritual came to its conclusion, and Jarnulfr let out a resounding whoop of triumph. It seemed the Alfathar in his golden halls on Holy Terra smiled upon them this day, for the king's crown was now linked with a macro-class teleport Homer. Even as the standoff between the Space Wolves and the Inquisition continued, Then Jarnulfr descended back to the surface of Midgardia, braving the fires and unstable caverns as he led a desperate search at the High King's last known location. Their desperate search soon yielded dividends when Auspex sensors picked up faint but regular vibrations deep below the surface. Making their way to the source of the disturbance, Jarnulfr had discovered a battered but very much alive Logan Grimnir and his king's guard. It seemed Morduk the Rotted had failed to kill the old wolf, whose thick Terminator armor had protected him from what would have been certain doom for irregular Asteroutes. Since his disappearance, less than 2 days but now a lifetime ago, Grimnir and his companions had been slowly digging their way back toward their surface using nothing but their power weapons. Battered and bruised, the High King was still imposing, even though the hololith projector. He seemed unsurprised to find Ragnar aboard the Inquisitor's ship, his dust-etched features briefly lifting up from their scowl lines into a smile as he listened to Blackmane downplay his latest exploits. Turning his attention to Karamazov, Grimnir shocked all gathered by announcing his intent to destroy Midgardia. Midgardia, beloved world though she is lost to us. The daemons have infested her to the core. However, I will not let her fall to an outworlder. Grimnir rumbled. Ragnar glanced at the other space wolf, Thenjarnulfr. However, the captain remained silent, no doubt as awed as he was by the old wolf's demeanor. But how will you accomplish such a feat? Asked Brother Captain Stern, bracing his hands upon the Stratageum dais. Morkai's tooth, we call it. In my holds is a warhead capable of sundering an entire world. Little did we think we'd have to use it within our very home system. The old wolf sighed, his weariness evident even through the hololith. I will give the order myself. At this, Karamazov could no longer remain silent. Be done with it already. The guilty must be judged. Their course settled, the ventral hangar doors of Alfathar's honor began to retract. All around them, the Inquisition fleet began to move away so as to avoid any shockwaves or debris from what would come to be known as Fire Mark +2. On the vessels of the Space Wolves, the Sons of Rus began to chant a funerary canticle, an ode to Midgardia as they prepared to burn her. With a shudder that rocked the entire vessel, the thrusters of Morkai's tooth ignited, sending it rocketing downward into the tortured crust of the planet. With bated breath, the Imperial forces watched from orbit, for the death of a world was, despite the Inquisition's reputation to the contrary, quite the rare occurrence. The burning nose cone of the missile careened through the atmosphere, down and down until it finally struck the ash dunes, plowing through the fractured crust to strike its target, the vast generator EMs that had once powered the hives. For a moment, all was still. Then Midgardia vanished. Those who gazed upon the judgment of Midgardia unshielded were instantly struck blind. Subject to the speed of light, the worlds of the system were briefly illuminated as the ball of flame turned all night into day. The death of a planet hurled a shrapnel blast of a million meteors in every direction, a lingering curse which would affect the worlds of the Fenris system for years to come. Midgardia died in fire and violence, and she inflicted her suffering on her sister worlds, subjecting them to tidal waves, firestorms, and volcanic eruptions from the waves of forces rippling out to smash into everything around them. It was a small mercy that the many millions of souls, who had survived the surface-level exterminatus only to be bombarded once more, perished instantly, wiped from existence along with the rest of the daemons of Nurgle that lurked in the caverns. Yet even as this cosmic pyre lit up the void of space, as Midgardia met her final end, there was to be little time to appreciate the spectacle. In the lightless depths of the warp, the sleek black hull of the dreaded Invincible Reason knifed through the Sea of Souls. The mighty Gloriana-class battleship, once the personal chariot of the arch-traitor Lionel Johnson, was now the flagship of one of his descendants. A mighty shark surrounded by a shoal of minnows. Upon a darkened bridge, the unmistakable figure of the angel who laughs crouched atop the ancient command throne where the ever-chosen of chaos had once sat, living up to his title as soft guffaws escaped his mouth every so often that were rendered into harsh bursts by his helmet. Every so often, Azrael would mumble to himself, speaking to the daemon Azazel that had been bound into his flesh so long ago, while around him, trembling mortals carried out their tasks of ensuring the flagship did not drop too deep into the warp, for the powers of the warp were about as merciless and unpredictable as their half-daemon master. In ages past, the self-titled Supreme Grand Master had carried a merry crusade across the galaxy, inflicting torment and slaughter as he sought to satisfy his urges. Thus it was in the course of his rampage that he found himself approached by agents of Ahriman, Osirian Lord of the Thousand Suns. Though he had of course initially attempted to slaughter Ahriman's emissaries, the wards protecting them had proven too much, and thus Azrael heard them out. What the Source-Rouse Master promised a madman like the angel who laughs is unknown, but a dark pact was forged that day. Thus the Star Phantoms, Azrael's personal warband, found themselves entering the Fenris system. Their task was a simple one: delay and destroy all Imperial forces present in the system. Joining them in this endeavor were the forces of Svein Wolfbad. Svein Wolfbad, the Blood Wolf. Most traitors hailing from the lineage of Rus come from the ranks of those cast into the warp during the Leonine Heresy, the so-called Oaken Yugr. Over countless eons in the warp, they were tortured into betraying their oaths. However, there are those outside of the 13th Great Company who turned their backs on the Imperium for other reasons, and of these treacherous dogs, Svein Wolfbad is the most feared. Disillusioned by the constant assault on his legion in the aftermath of the First War for Armageddon, Then Wolfbad loosed his forces against an Inquisition task force without permission, slaughtering both the Inquisition and those of his svate who would not follow him into rebellion. Over the centuries, Wolfbad nurtured his hatred of imperial bureaucracy and the Inquisition in particular. In time he and his men fell to worship of Kern, the blood god, painting their armor bronze and incorporating blasphemous symbols in place of their totems. Since then, the Blood Wolves has butchered a dozen imperial installations, reveling in filling satellites and research stations with the oceans of blood poured out in the name of their dark god. Such is their grudge with the Inquisition and their former brethren that the Blood Wolves willingly allied with sorcerers such as the Tiantian Thousand Sons of Ahriman and the Slaaneshi Azrael and his Star Phantoms. Azrael's bridge crew had learned long ago never to question their master, and so when the half-daemon had ordered them to drop into the Fenris system beyond the normal Mandeville points, they did not question it. As one the mighty flagship and her attendants lurched out of the warp, resurfacing into reality from amidst the rubble of Midgardia. The destruction of the daemon-tainted world, less than an hour before, had rendered the fabric of real space more permeable than usual, a fact Azrael took advantage of just as Ahriman's forces had. However, such a translation was far from safe. An Iconoclast-class destroyer emerged in the heart of an asteroid, its inhabitants killed instantly. A trio of infidel-class raiders found themselves conjoined together, their long centipede of a craft now utterly dead in the void until its crew could figure out how to regain control. However, the Invincible Reason herself was unharmed, and in a prime position to begin their assault immediately. The Imperial Navy fleet was caught utterly by surprise, unprepared for a fleet of warships to appear so close to them, much less one containing a Gloriana-class battleship. The Chaos Fleet's first salvo knocked out a dozen ships, mostly lesser cruisers and destroyers that were on the outside of the picket. At the heart of the clustered Imperial warships, the mighty Alfather's honor was quick to react, for her High King was at the helm. Karamazov's temper was nearly as fast, resurfacing like a volcano at the sight of Chaos ships. The Lord Inquisitor roared out a series of commands at his unready acolytes to annihilate the intruders. As the Innocentian Nihilda Claret swung in the direction of the enemy fleet, Brother Captain Stern and Jarl Ragnar made for the hangars, eager to return to their own vessels and join the fight. On the Invincible Reason, a kaleidoscope swirl of flames briefly lit up her darkened bridge, and as they faded away, the hooded figure of the changeling was revealed. The daemon performed a mocking bow to Azrael before pointing 3 of its 4 arms toward the view screen, which showed the disorganized fleets of Imperial warships. At the sight of his unprepared enemies, who still had their guns pointed at each other, Azrael clapped his armored hands. Their bargain upheld, a trembling mortal brought forth an ancient tome, whose skin-bound cover blinked as it stared upwards with reptilian eyes. The changeling quickly grabbed the book, no doubt eager to learn whatever it may have contained, and vanished once more, leaving the hapless cultist to look at the tentacles that had once been his hands. Chapter 6, The Fires of Change. A stellar battle of epic proportions had begun in the smoldering rubble of what had once been Midgardia. This was no set-piece engagement, of 2 sides lining up in good order to unleash their broadsides. This was a brawl. Such was the preference of Azrael, which was, as suited his nature, pure chaos. After unleashing their initial shots, the fleet of the Star Phantoms had hurled themselves into the midst of the Imperial fleet. The servants of the ruinous powers were thus free to fire in every direction, utterly fearless of hitting their own as the Imperial fleet greatly outnumbered them in terms of ship numbers. The hidebound Imperial Navy was thus immediately at a disadvantage, for their doctrines meant orders needed to come from the top down, for no captain would dare act on his own in the presence of an Inquisitor Lord. Luckily for the Imperium, the Space Wolves were under no such restrictions. The battle group of the 6th Legion immediately responded, for rather than servitors or criminals impressed into service, the Space Wolves employed Legion serfs, free men who had not passed the Asteroot's trials for one reason or another but still wished to serve the High King. Aboard the mighty battle barge Holmgang, Jarl Blackmane was among the vanguard, pushing his ship to the forefront to make up for lost time. Ragnar was eager to face the Sons of the Lion once more. Long ago, he had faced them upon the jungle world of Hyades. The invasion of a company of dark angels upon a world protected by the Sons of Rus had turned out to be a precursor to a massive offensive by the 1,000 Suns across a dozen planets, and Blackmane had won great glory by retrieving the legendary artifact the Spear of Rus from the wicked sorcerer Maddox the Undying. However, the Holmgang found itself blocked from engaging the Star Phantoms by the equally imposing Garmer. The traitorous Wolfbad's hatred for the Inquisition was surpassed only by his desire to shed the blood of his former brothers, and he had no shortage of targets this day. To Wolfbad, Blackmane and his men were merely obstacles in his path, a prelude to his true target, the Alfather's honor. The Chaos Lord desired more than anything to offer up Grimnir's skull to the Skull Throne. Until that time though, he would continue to let the blood flow, for rather than direct his forces from the bridge, Wolfbad and his retinue were already in their boarding craft. As the ships of the line battered at each other with lance and macro cannon, boarding teams of bloodthirsty traitors had already cut their way into the sides of a dozen loyalist craft. Intent on slaughtering everyone they could find, the bronze-armored blood wolves were nightmares incarnated. The Legion thralls, brave though they were, stood no chance against the murderous intruders, who slaughtered their former kin without regard to past loyalty. The blood wolves had no fear of dying themselves, fearlessly matching their strength against their loyalist counterparts in the name of letting the blood flow. The savage fury inherited by every son of Rus was unleashed upon the warriors of Fenris, and soon half a dozen craft drifted listlessly in the void, their engines and guns silenced from within. Their tally of kills was matched only by the Invincible Reason herself, a god of death among mortals. Heedless of the plane of battle or who was on the receiving end of its firepower, the mighty battleship corkscrewed through the scrum, launching port and starboard broadsides one after another. Before long, dozens of warships were dead in the void. This was a battle of annihilation, for both sides knew turning their backs on the enemy would only warrant a summary execution. The Imperial Navy commanders knew full well the Lord Inquisitor would not hesitate to carry out the deed himself should any of his commanders even suggest retreat while heretics lay before them. Despite his age, Karamazov was no naval commander, and spent most of the battle filling his bridge with invectives as he yelled out his fury at those ships which had already fallen, cursing them for failing to do his will. Thus it was less than an hour into the battle that his advisors administered calming serums to keep the elderly Inquisitor from apoplexy. The fury of Grimner on the other hand stemmed from another source. As High King, he knew full well even had he not been wounded that he needed to stay on the bridge and command his fleet. Grimner had full faith in his men and in young Ragnar, but he was irritated nonetheless. The High King knew full well they were being delayed, for Ulrich's calls for aid had reached him. The rune priests aboard the Alfather's honor could sense the disaster even now unfolding on Fenris, and yearned to return to defend the Fang. However, to abandon the fight would doom them all, for without the mighty flagship, there wasn't a single vessel that could stand up to the invincible reason. In truth, Grimner doubted his vessel could either, but it was his duty to give his all, and he would not let his men down. Aboard the Holmgang, Jarl Ragnar also knew they were being delayed. However, he had much more pressing concerns, for his vessel had been boarded by the Chaos Lord Wolfbad himself. The traitorous master of the Blood Wolves was a hulking brute bedecked in bronze Terminator armor, rattling with skulls and symbols of the Blood God in place of the Fenrisian totems he had once worn. If Svein recognized Ragnar as a Jarl, he gave no sign of it, for he fought like a madman, his long grey beard a testament to his veteran status. It took every bit of the young wolf's skill to survive his initial onslaught, for Wolfbad's strength was enhanced by both his ancient armor and the blessings of his foul god. Blackmane focused on avoiding his foe's strikes, slashing at cables and joints in the brief moments when Wolfbad's axe buried itself in walls and bulkheads. Ragnar ducked another slash of his foe's frost axe. It had been beyond difficult to retain his focus, for Wolfbad's aura called to the fury latent within him, urging him to give in to the same bloodlust that dominated his enemy. He knew full well to do so may well spell the end of him, for there was no guarantee it would be enough to overcome the traitor's brute strength. Svein was nearly as large as Hygr the Mountain, his old friend and companion on the Wolf Blade, though far less jovial. However, against a foe such as Wolfbad, even this momentary distraction cost Ragnar dearly, and the young Jarl threw himself to the ground, losing only a good portion of his topknot instead of his head to Wolfbad's blow. Enough of this, Ragnar thought. I've got better things to do than die. Baring his teeth in a savage growl, the Jarl gave into the red tide, tapping into the deepest instinct inherent to all sons of Rus that he had suppressed until now. Ragnar pulled his bolt pistol, unleashing its full payload in Wolfbad's exposed face. Such a move was on the surface futile, for all of the rounds rebounded harmlessly, for the traitor was protected by both his armor and his patron. However, the intent had not been to wound. Wolfbad flinched, an involuntary reaction even deeper than his blood rage as his instincts forced him to protect himself. The Chaos Lord brought his arm up to shield his face, but Ragnar had already moved on. Dropping the now spent bolt pistol to the ground with a clatter, he rose to one knee, gripping Frost Fang in both hands as he drove the chain sword upwards into his foe's now exposed torso with all his strength. In response, Svein Wolfbad let loose a bellow of agony, a deafening sound even amidst the clamor of the roaring chainsword. The traitor dropped his blade to the ground, and for a moment, it seemed like he was going to recover, arms swinging downward in an attempt to seize Ragnar's unprotected head. But his wounds proved too much, and with a resounding clang, the traitor fell backwards onto the deck, Frost Fang protruding from his gut as Ragnar panted above him. For a moment, his latent fury threatened to overwhelm him, his instincts screaming at him to attack and attack again. But the moment passed, and Ragnar forced himself to regain control once more, retrieving Frost Fang before the traitor's blood could corrupt it. The duel of the young wolf and the blood wolf had reached its climax unaware and uncaring of the larger battle around them. The fleets of the Space Wolves and Inquisition had taken heavy losses in the initial strike, but as the minutes turned into hours, the tide slowly began to turn in their favor. This shift was compounded by the arrival of the fleet of the Grey Knights and Raven Guard from Frostheim. The Imperial reinforcements had taken heavy losses on the ground, but their ships were unscathed, and inflicted a punishing barrage on the traitor fleet. The fleet of Titan in particular was a boon for Grimner, as their sanctified ships would make short work of the demonic-enhanced vessels, and with this in mind, he made his move. With a sudden lurch, the Alfather's honor buelled its way through to finally break free of the scrum, sailing away from the battle in the direction of the Wolf's Eye, the mighty sun at the heart of the system. There were no traitor ships to bar her path anymore, for this heading was the opposite direction of Fenris. Using the gravity of the star, Grimnir's vessel slingshotted itself back around, straining its engines to the max to add to its momentum. Even as the Imperial and Chaos fleets continued to battle it out, Alfather's honor soared high above them, making for Fenris itself. The High King's desperation had become palpable, for the calls for aid from Ulrich the High Priest had begun to arrive, scattered voices shouting in the darkness. For too long they had been stifled and slowed by enemy interference, both source rouse and technological, but now the true damage inflicted upon Fenris became clear. Upon the icy slopes of the Fang, reports of the battle that continued to rage as the Space Wolves and the armies of the Inquisition reaped a heavy toll upon each other. The pristine snows were now a vivid crimson, slicked with pools of blood that had frozen into icy sheets in the frigid climate. Across the slopes, thousands of Valhallans now lay strewn in various positions of death. Commander Chinkov had lived up to his single-minded reputation, ordering wave after wave of men to exhaust the defenders' ammunition, and had marched nearly halfway up the slope before he had been eliminated by a stray artillery strike. A blackened crater marked what remained of Chinkov and his headquarters, the snow around it covered in the footprints left behind by the decimated ice warriors who had fled after their insane commander had finally died. The Space Wolves did not pursue, instead shifting their forces to eliminate the Adeptus Auroritas. The fanatic Sisters of the Order of the Divine Lamentation had fought to the last, utterly convinced they were serving the God Emperor by destroying mutants and their allies. It had taken dozens of kill teams many hours to uproot them from their positions, and many brave Valkyria and Space Wolves had paid the price to obtain victory. The Forge Hills were now utterly wrecked, their foundries laid low by detonations as the Sisters destroyed everything in order to deny the Space Wolves anything other than a Pyrrhic victory. It was in this frenzy of self-harm and treachery that the legions of the Warp finally appeared upon the Hearth world. Across Fenris itself, initially spared from the ravages of the infernal Tetrad, the power of Tzientch foretold doom to the home world of the 6th Legion. Tectonic forces, normally only felt during the season of fire, convulsed the continents as volcanoes erupted, but their magma was an unnatural pink. Vast tsunamis swept over entire islands, drowning villages, and leaving only those out to sea as homeless survivors. From cracks in the ground and from the insides of volcanoes, hordes of gibbering daemons had clambered forth. Glaciers cracked and splintered to reveal a trillion eyes which drove those who gazed upon it to insanity. Daemons of Tzientch beyond count had come to bring change. Cackling horrors hurled mutagenic fireballs with glee, while high above, flocks of screamers knifed through the skies. Croaking Lord of Change, those avian-headed greater daemons who carried out the will of Tzientch, unleashed spells and hexes beyond that of any mortal psyker. Those tribesmen unfortunate enough to face the denizens of the Immaterium found themselves forever changed by the experience, haunted by the sanity-stretching nature of the Court of Change. Such was the curse inflicted upon the tribes of Fenris, for those who may one day have joined the ranks of the Sky Warriors now bore a lingering penalty that would hurt the Space Wolves grievously in the years to come. In the skies, the swirling lights of the Fenrica Borealis intensified, hues of green and blue changing into hideous oranges and reds. Those children unfortunate enough to be born beneath it were malformed abominations, mewling freaks of nature that attacked their parents and the midwives that had delivered them. Entire tribes began to mutate as baleful clouds pouring out of the volcanoes blanketed them in radioactive ash. The lucky ones perished, those less fortunate souls chosen by the architect of fate changed, their bodies sprouting animalistic features and supernumerary limbs in an agonizing process that damned them to a short life of pain before they were put down by their kin. Such was the will of Ahriman, a contrapasso of the mutations Russ's sons had condemned Prospero for so long ago. Yet these lights were but the beginning, for from swirling portals to hell, 9 terrible towers manifested. From these floating bastions poured forth the armies of the Thousand Suns, eager to bring suffering to those villages not yet touched by change. Wary of the Fang's mighty batteries, the silver towers of the Thousand Suns had emerged far away to wreak havoc without fear of retaliation. Content for the time being to allow the Space Wolves and the armies of the Inquisition to battle, Ahriman's brethren focused their attention on the helpless villages. Where Russ and his men had performed a decapitation strike on Tisca, the denizen of Old Prospero sought the reverse, unleashed catastrophe everywhere else as both an irony and to avoid the Fang's defenses. Thus the silver towers floated serenely through the skies, disgorging hosts of thousand suns and their auxiliaries to slaughter everything below. Wherever the armies of Sorcerias walked, mutation, death, and change followed. Packs of howling Shogal, the monstrous jackal-like mutants that had once been noble Astaroths, butchered village after primitive village. Brave Fenricians, equipped with nothing but Iron Age weaponry, put up a valiant but futile defense, torn to shreds by maddened beasts that feasted on their flesh. Alongside them, their handlers unleashed devastation upon the landscape by their sorcerous acumen. With but a wave of a hand, ancient forests burst into flame, a closed fist crushed town halls that had stood for centuries, a whispered curse tore the breath from the lungs of whimpering children, who fell silent as they asphyxiated in their hiding places. Amidst the smoldering ashes left by the daemons and Shogal, the true threat emerged. With all resistance swept away before them, the sorcerers of the Thousand Suns emerged from portals and stepped down from discs of Tsianch. Surrounded by the slain, for the transition from life to death was a source of great change, the Arcana Astaroths began to lay the groundwork for a dark and terrible ritual. High above, the silver towers floated serenely into positions of geomantic significance, aligned with soaring volcanoes and the ley lines beneath them. At some signal known only to them, the towers unleashed coruscating beams of raw madness into the pyroclastic fissures below, torturing the land and corrupting Fenris as mutagenic force burrowed into the planet's molten core. Ahriman's own tower was located above the Fire Breather, the greatest volcano in all of Fenris, located just off the coast of Asaheim near the Yirokja Glacier. From its summit, the Osirian Lord observed his forces, the conductor of a vast orchestra now in a rare good humor. Though he had long since lost the physical faculties to laugh, the Osirian Lord nonetheless gave it his best effort, his tower shuddering in response to the foul sound as the souls of the damned echoed in hateful sympathy. Yet Ahriman's mirth was not the true cause of this quake, but rather the result of the prisoner bound within. Even without looking, Ahriman knew it had been the insane thrashing of his father, Magnus the Red, unable to escape the enchanted chains which bound him in a jail of Ahriman's own design. The state of the Med-Cyclops was the price exacted for the power the Ipposimus wielded during the Great Crusade, the hidden toll exacted by Tsianch from a bargain whose terms were known only to the Changer. The Great Deceiver had played all of the Thousand Suns false, including Ahriman, whose visions had proven false. Never during the glory years of the Great Crusade had he suspected he would spend 10 millennia entombed within a dreadnought sarcophagus, unable to properly wield the warp in any meaningful way. However, as the servants of the god of hope and ambition, Ahriman had come to believe this state of affairs would not last forever. All he needed was the right bargain to make the fickle changer of ways alter the deal. Yet to bring Magnus to Fenris would require great sacrifice and reagents of the rarest kind. The Osirian Lord had planned for this day for centuries, and thus even as the towers unleashed their arcane might into the volcanoes, Ahriman's chosen elite now marched through the portals onto the very slopes of the Fang itself. Order of the Jackal. As Ahriman himself could attest, even the mightiest of sorcerers can still fall in battle. However, dreadnought bodies of cold adamantium lack a strong natural connection to the immaterium, driving any of weak will attempting to connect with the warp utterly mad, a fate worse than death to the intensely psychic sons of Magnus. Thus shortly after joining the Great Crusade, their brilliant father Magnus the Red devised a solution to this problem. Utilizing a psychometric crown wrapped around the fallen Astartes' brain, along with a modified Contemptor dreadnought sarcophagus, the Crimson King created the Osiran pattern dreadnought. Though typically armed with a melee weapon on one fist and a heavy weapon on the other, the Osiran's greatest weapon was its ability to interface with the immaterium. In battle, this can be observed through their use of force weapons, empowering their blades into conduits of deadly warp energies, as well as minor feats of precognition and telekinesis. When Ahriman fell in battle, it was into one of these sarcophagi that he was entombed, earning him the title of Osirian Lord. Other sorcerers have undergone this process willingly, embracing the certainty of steel and the power of the machine to enable them to wade into the heart of battle unthreatened by small arms fire. Such warriors, and the attendants and thralls who oversee the entombment process, are part of the cabal known as the Order of the Jackal, and are some of the toughest and heaviest weapons that the Thousand Suns can bring to bear. Protected by mighty kine shields, A talon of dreadnoughts in the unmistakable blue and yellow of the 15th Legion began their march up the snowy slopes of the Fang. They were accompanied on their endeavor by a snarling pack of Shogal, the bestial creatures instinctually racing to join the assault still covered in the gore of their victims. Such an overt assault normally would have been easily picked off by automated defensive batteries, but the turrets had fallen silent. In the depths of the mountain, many of the generator EMs responsible for powering the weapons platforms fell victim to treachery and sabotage, and only a desperate defense by the Space Wolves had prevented the same fate befalling the thick void shields. Up and up the mountain they marched, a living battering ram of adamantium, steel, and cold hatred. Dark blessings and their powerful shields protected them, deflecting what few handheld anti-tank rounds were sent their way with contemptuous ease. However, the Space Wolves were far from helpless. From deep beneath the forge hold, down and down beneath the cliffs and hills of rough-hewn rock, an iron door creaked open. Upon this ancient aperture, a carving of the twin-headed wolf Morkai, guardian of the dead, snarled silently as the subterranean vaults of the Underfang opened at the command of Ulrich the Slayer. The ground began to shake as rhythmic echoes, like that of drums in the deep, resounded forth. Up and up, through ancient tunnels spanning the length of the Fang marched the honored dead. The ancients were marching to war. Awakened by the Iron Priests by arcane technomancy, nearly 70 mighty walkers from every era of the 6th Legion's 10,000-year history smashed into the Thousand Suns with the fury of a meteor. All chaos broke loose as the Thousand Suns' sudden incursion was stopped dead in its tracks by a living blue-gray tide. The air was filled with a hurricane of assault cannon shells, drifts of snow were superheated into bubbling puddles as melta shots and plasma fire streaked overhead, and great chunks of flesh were torn by scything lightning claws and pulped by huge fists. At the head of this mighty column was Bjorn the Fell-Handed, the most venerable hero in the entire Legion, for it was he who led the Legion in years gone by, and it was he who had repelled the Thousand Suns at the last battle of the Fang in M32. None could match his fury as his mighty lightning claw, the legendary fell hand for which he was named, slashed through one foe after another. Though he voiced only bellows of fury, in his heart Bjorn felt deeply troubled. In the olden days, his Primarch Leman Russ had singled him out to remain behind, departing with the rest of his companions for parts unknown. Since then, the former Legion Master had wondered when his master would show up again. Though firmly a believer in the forgotten imperial truth which rejected all notions of divinity and superstition, Bjorn could not help but ponder on the prophecies his Legion descendants seemed to hold so dear. The idea that Russ would not show up until Ragnarok, the fabled end times, was both promising and disturbing. However, the Fell-Handed's ancient mind soon turned back to the task at hand, for this would no doubt go down as one of the greatest battles since the Leonine Heresy itself. The Thousand Suns had lost none of their prowess as Astaroths, and they inflicted a gruesome toll upon the sons of Russ in this battle of the ancients. Many dreadnoughts were pulled down by snarling packs of Shogal as the horse-sized abominations stripped them open to devour the Astaroths inside. Others suffered all manner of gruesome ends from their Osiran counterparts, blasted off the narrow causeway by gales of psychic force, struck by lightning, crushed like refuse in a compactor. The inventiveness of the Thousand Suns was matched only by their cruelty, and they made many Space Wolves suffer heinously before enduring their final death. Yet the weight of numbers had begun to prevail. One by one, the Osiran dreadnoughts were eliminated, torn apart and hacked to death by mighty frost axes. Inspired by the presence of mighty Bjorn, the Space Wolves thrust deep into the enemy formation, where they discovered Ahriman himself was amongst his dreadnought brethren. The Osirian Lord had sworn vengeance against the Fell-Handed 8 millennia prior, and had now come to claim it. The two juggernauts smashed into each other with all the fury they could muster, a rivalry in which only one could survive. Through a portal, another snarling pack of Shogal launched themselves at the other Space Wolves, a distraction to ensure none would interfere with their duel. The two metal giants hacked and clawed, smashing each other as they voiced sentiments of hatred and fury through Vox speakers. The entirety of the Battle of Fenris hinged upon this battle between the two former Legion Masters. All knew if Bjorn could overcome his ancient foe as he had before that the assault would buckle and collapse, for without Ahriman to pull the strings, the tapestry of lies and treachery he had woven would unravel. Yet even Bjorn did not suspect the true depth of the Osirian Lord's schemes. During the Great Crusade, Ahriman had been Magister Templi of the Corvidi cult, the master of the masters of precognition. Where his other gifts had atrophied after his entombment, Ahriman's foresight had only increased, and thus every moment leading up to this had been carefully plotted out and accounted for, from the destruction of the generator Eames to the arrival of Bjorn at the head of the honored ancients. Thus Ahriman began his endgame. Exposing his right flank in a manner too tempting to pass up, the Osirian lord allowed his foe to slash a gaping rent in his side. As the crackling lightning claw of the fell hand pierced Ahriman's armored flank, it shredded an ancient tablet, a reagent whose function Ahriman had purposefully not utilized in 10 millennia. With the caustic smell of a promethium fire and the crash of a collapsing hive, the demonic known as Aetpio manifested in all its terrible glory between the two combatants. The demonic tutelary, an ever-shifting collection of eyes and wheels of light, immediately lashed out at Bjorn, severing the Ancient One's arm at the wrist before blasting him with psychic force. With a shuddering crash, the venerable fell-handed fell backward into the snow, bereft of his namesake, which Ahriman snatched up. Leaving his mortal enemy to the non-existent mercy of the Shogal, Ahriman retreated through the portal, not waiting to watch the outcome as he returned to the safety of his tower. As the rift snapped shut, the Osirian lord mentally called out to his demonic allies and Sorcerous brethren, informing them the time had finally come. Fully aware of the larger battle, Ahriman sensed his Star Phantom mercenaries had successfully engaged the Inquisition fleet. The escape of Logan Grimner, while unanticipated, would not matter much now, for the Osirian lord was ready to begin his endgame. Across Fenris, reality shivered as the flux cairns contained within the floating silver towers thrummed with arcane force. Ritual offerings of space wolves' gene seed stolen over the course of centuries was mingled with the blood of sacrificed Astaroths, poured out onto the soil of Fenris as a curse. At the center of the Enneagram, Ahriman offered forth the severed arm of the fell-handed, upon which the congealed ichor of a god began to bubble. As the ancient blood joined with the other sacrifices, reality was wrenched open with all the force of an animal bursting out of a cage. In the shadow of Ahriman's tower, amidst blood-soaked drifts of tainted snow, twin horns were the first to appear, ivory and bone wreathed in circlets of gold and bronze. Next came a pair of wings that shimmered and shifted across a prismatic spectrum of colors so vivid it hurt the eyes to behold. The dull red of the gore-slicked snow transformed into a vivid crimson that coalesced into a towering giant, armored and chained by ancient panoply. Magnus the Red, Crimson King of Prospero, bellowed his mindless fury up at the nearby heights of the Fang, for somewhere in his animalistic mind he recognized the home of his ancient foes. War Zone, Fenris. A Saga of Spite and Vengeance Part 3. The stain of chaos fouled the skies. The Crimson King arose from myth, and brought upon the sons of Rus a grievous blow, a slaying of worlds. Pon Fenris fell the Cyclops blade. The weave of mortal life was shorn. A vengeance wrought long eons before, reflected in a lake of fire. Change is in the air. For 10 millennia, the space wolves have maintained a stagnant status quo, a dam holding back the tides of chaos wherever they seep through. Now as the warp surges, threatening to burst its levees and enter the material realms, war has come to the Fenris system itself. The most powerful sorcerers in the galaxy, the Thousand Suns, have now invaded the home world of the space wolves alongside a menagerie of allies and unwitting pawns. Already most of the Fenris system's worlds lie in ruins, in the hands of both Chaos and Imperial aggressors alike, and the once prosperous planet of Midgardia is now little more than a collection of asteroids floating in the battle-choked void. Once more the armies of fate march upon the Fang, the mighty fortress of the space wolves whose outer layers already burn in the fires of war. The sons of Magnus seek nothing less than to rip out the heart and future of the 6th Legion in search of a revenge that has been millennia in the offing. Can the sons of Rus, and their desperate allies, overcome the dictates of the architect of fate and his servants? Or will mutual suspicions and conflicting goals doom Fenris? All that is certain is that the end times have begun here, at the close of the 41st millennium. Chapter 7, Girder Demerun. War engulfs the Fenris system. Not since the Scouring had a Legion homeworld been assaulted in such a manner. Over millennia past, the frozen death world that serves as the home of the 6th Legion came under attack from the Thousand Suns, the Ecclesiarchy, and the Inquisition. All of these attempts were foiled, stopped in their tracks by the sons of Rus each and every time they occurred. Yet now their luck seems to have finally run out. Most of the Legion is elsewhere, gone to defend an Imperium beset on all sides. Ancient grudges have been twisted and used by the servants of chaos, turning the armies of the Imperium, from the numberless Astra Militarum, to the fanatic Adeptus Sororitas, to the suspicious Inquisition, to unite against the sons of Rus. Yet as the blind turned their fury on their fellow servants of the Emperor, the true architects of this disaster have made themselves known. The Thousand Sons, the chosen legion of Tzientch, have begun their latest and most terrible web of plots and conspiracies, and have created an ironic echo of their rivals' actions from so long ago. Once the Space Wolves had been on the offensive during the Scouring, yet now they were on the defensive, outnumbered and on the back foot as they faced destruction at the hands of one-time allies. Though they knew only a fraction of the Space Wolves were present in the system, the sons of Magnus intended to inflict a crippling defeat on his enemies by destroying their home, their people, and their gene seed repositories. Much of this disaster has unfolded before the sons of Magnus even arrived. From the depths of the warp, the infernal Tetrad, a mighty host of daemons, have invaded the worlds of the Fenris system. Dark bargains with powerful warlords such as Azrael the Half-Daemon and Svein Wolfbad and his Blood Wolves, have unleashed still more death and ruin upon the sons of Rus. And yet the worst is yet to come, for the Thousand Sons, the ancient enemies of the Space Wolves, now run amok on Fenris itself, killing her people and ravaging her lands. Through vile rituals, they have sundered the land, intruding up to the very battlements of the Fang itself, threatening to destroy it from the inside even as greater hosts press toward her very gates. The architect of all these atrocities is Ozek Ahriman, Legion Master of the Thousand Sons. 10 millennia ago, during the galaxy-shattering civil war known as the Leonine Heresy, Ahriman was perhaps the greatest mortal psyker in the Legion's Asteroutes. Yet his downfall upon the world of Kur at the hands of Argiltal of the Word-Bearers left him unable to utilize his prodigious talents as he once had. Entombed within a dreadnought, Ahriman has had 10 millennia to plot his hopes and hone his ambitions, for there is little he desires more than to regain his former glory. So too does he wish to undo the curse of the flesh change inflicted upon his brethren, for it would do little good for him to regain a body only to succumb to that ancient curse. Thus 10 millennia worth of plots and schemes have led to this day, countless ancient bargains now come due. The Osirian Lord knows only Tzientch, the chaos god of fate whom he serves, is capable of granting his desires, but only at great cost. To that end, Ahriman has carried out the will of the great conspirator at every waking moment, feeding his master with ambitions, schemes, plots, and deceits. Through extensive rituals of soothsaying and augury, the Osirian Lord believes that the destruction of the Space Wolves, who have resolutely opposed chaos in general and the sorceries of Tzientch in particular, would gain his master's favor enough to achieve these ends. Thus as the 41st millennium comes to a close, Ahriman, and as many of the Thousand Sons he could bend to his will have come to bring doom to the sons of Rus. The attention of the architect of fate was thus fixated upon Fenris as few other systems as the 41st millennium came to a close. The mutagenic power of the warp has begun to seep through into real space with ever greater potency, unleashed as a side effect of the schemes of the Thousand Sons. As the maddened energies spread beneath the ground, they began to suffuse the entire planet. Fenris shuddered as corruption seeped into her molten heart, an agony that began to corrupt the death world from the inside out. The tendrils of power flowed through Fenris's asthenosphere, spreading across the mantle and core until they had stretched beneath it all. Deep below Asaheim, this tainted magma flowed from its mantle reservoirs up and up through the conduits beneath the Fang itself. None had never thought to guard against what lay so far beneath, and thus in the deepest caverns, a new swarm of daemons erupted. Their fiery forms had joined the molten rivers, unharmed by the heat and pressure, and now they were in the heart of the Space Wolves' domain. Joining the daemons were the mighty cult of the Piri, those sons of Magnus who specialized in pyrokinesis. Their forbidden magics had transmuted their bodies into living warp fire, their fiery forms shielded as they swam through magma immune to its heat. Chief among these ancient warriors was the sorcerer known as Malagor Ora Magma, captain of the Eighth Fellowship. In the ancient past, Ora Magma had been among those exiled to Terra in the aftermath of Nakia, where he and his brothers were watched over by the salamanders. While never the Magister Templi of his cult, Ora Magma's skill with flame had won him the admiration of the sons of Fukin. Such was his dark humor that he repaid his captors by burning many of them to death during his escape from Terra. All of the Thousand Sons beneath the Fang were of the same cult as Ora Magma, and were to a man mighty sorcerers. The bestial Shogal had not accompanied them, for they could not transmute their bodies like their Psyker brethren. Thus it was that some of the most ancient and diabolical Astaroths entered the heart of the Fang. Together they bent their wills to the same task, clapping their hands together in order to unleash a mighty molten beam which melted through the ancient stone roots of the mountain. Accompanied by their demonic familiars, the cult of the Piri began the long march upward. Their goal was the destruction of the generator Eoms buried deep within the Fang. If these ancient engines could be silenced, the mighty weapons batteries protecting the Fang would fall silent along with the void shields which protected the mountain. Such was the distance that they had to climb, and such was their skill at slaughter, that it was several hours before the alarm went out, forcing the space wolves to respond to this fiery dagger piercing through the heart of their fortress. Danger beset the space wolves on every side. Even as Ahriman and the other dreadnoughts fought beneath the towering battlements, while Aura Magma and his brothers climbed through the cavernous underbelly of the Fang, packs of howling Shogal, fresh from butchering the villages located near the Fang, had prowled up the mountainside. The rubrics were accompanied by their handlers, the bird-like Zongors, who shepherded their bestial charges toward the terrified Valhallan's survivors. Having already fragged their commissars in order to flee, there was nobody left to maintain discipline amongst their ranks, and thus they suffered immense casualties. Panicked fusillades of las gunfire rippled out, but the mindless Shogal charged anyway, tearing the guardsmen to pieces. The lower slopes of the Fang were filled with the screams of the dying, many of whom were eaten alive by the Zongors and rubrics. As news of these invaders and the ecological disaster they wrought reached the space wolves, they realized for the first time the true extent of the danger they faced. High in the Fang, Ulrich the Slayer issued a message to all his brethren, ordering them to focus their attention on the Thousand Suns. On the barren moon of Valdramani, Jarl Crom Dragongaze answered the summons, hastily gathering his Drake Slayers to make the short journey back to the Fang. Joined by the mighty Enjal Stormacaller, the Jarl and his men descended into the depths of their home, determined to meet the invaders head-on. They arrived in the nick of time, halting the Thousand Suns from destroying the generator Eoms powering the upper void shields. While Astaroths fought Daemon, Enjal and the other rune priests matched their skill against that of Aura Magma and his brethren, a war of ice and fire that saw both sides unleash every iota of their psychic mastery. The caverns of the Fang were filled with spectacular displays of might and fury as the Thousand Suns and their demonic allies battled with the daemons. While hundreds fought and died around them, Enjal and Aura Magma focused all their attention on each other. Each Astaroths was the unchallenged masters of their craft, and their warrior pride meant they would not rest until they had obtained victory. From the depths of Fenris, Aura Magma called forth serpents of lava, breathed out torrent of flames from his mouth, and sung a wild song whose notes were old when the universe was young to unleash an incandescent aura of supernova fury. In return, the Stormacaller lived up to his title, unleashing the Tempest's wrath as he slammed his gauntlets together with mighty thunderclaps, hurling bolts of lightning and freezing hail as he sought to lay his enemy low. However, while the two Psykers were evenly matched, the battles around them were not. The Space Wolves suffered grievous casualties as the other Piri sorcerers of the Thousand Suns unleashed their fiery fury upon them, but they would not relent. With dogged determination, the Sons of Rus fought to protect their home, and gradually pushed back the tides of daemons. They were helped in this by the arrival of aid unlooked for a veritable host of neophytes from every stage of their ascension had come to defend their home. They would not stand idly by while their brothers fell to defend them, and it soon became clear to Enjal how they had made their way to depths none of them had ever been, for amongst their ranks was Thenlucas the Trickster. His natural charisma and undeniable talent for leading blood claws made him a welcome ally in these dark hours, and many a foe fell to his blade. However, while the Trickster and the Stormacaller found success against the Piri, the battles above them were not going so well. The confusion wrought by the Inquisition's invasion had rendered the Space Wolves disorganized and unable to properly respond to a planet-wide invasion. Many aircraft were shot down in the midst of uncoordinated strikes against the Silver Towers, whose Source-Rouse defenses had lashed them out of the sky. On the slopes of the Fang, a few hundred Astaroths fought beside what remained of the Valkyria to stem the advance of the Shogal packs, while the people of Fenris died by the tens of thousands to the rampaging sorcerer hosts. In the chamber of the watch, Ulrich the Slayer attempted to command his disparate forces, but even his tactical acumen was not enough to turn the tide. However, things were about to go from bad to worse, for the most grim tidings of all made their way to the command center at the heart of the Fang. Chapter 8, In the Court of the Crimson King. Though no Asteroutes feels fear, they can feel dread. They can feel doubt. And who could blame the Space Wolves for feeling this way when their mortal enemy Magnus the Red, Crimson King of Old Prospero, had come to Fenris? To their credit though, no son of Rus hesitated. As the slavering red-skinned giant howled out his fury into skies lit by the fires of change, 100 shots opened up into him from all sides. A dozen ruby beams from las cannons struck at the speed of light, followed shortly thereafter by the molten beams from Meltus. A trio of missiles threw up a cloud of smoke that was immediately pierced by glowing green orbs of plasma that hissed as it struck home. Bolter rounds drummed out a steady beat from 100 different sources, and for a brief moment, hope surged that the daemon had been banished before he could get a firm grip upon reality. Alas for the sons of Rus, hope itself was their enemy, for their foe was the favored tool of the architect of fate. As the smoke cleared, it revealed a shimmering kind shield wreathing the daemon Primarch. Though mindless, Magnus Rufus was still the most powerful psyker in the galaxy save for the Emperor, a being of the warp who instinctively wielded it without even thinking. Rearing up to his full imposing height, the Crimson King smashed his arms into the ground like an enraged gorilla, sending out concussive waves of pure force that hurled everyone around him back a dozen meters. Entire squads of space wolves were crushed in their armor, the totems warding their ancient ceramite worthless against such mortal wounds. Once more Magnus let out a bone-chilling roar, a scream of furious insanity that threatened to drive those who heard it mad. As the sound of his cry echoed out, the landscape around the Primarch began to twist and alter as reality itself began to break down in the face of this primordial madness. Eager to be free of his chains, the Lord of Old Prospero began a loping gait up the slope, for somewhere in his bestial mind, he recognized the familiar sight of the Fang which he had assaulted so long ago. Each footstep left by his clawed feet left a twisted imprint in the snow, seeping raw madness that spread to the hardy pines and ruined buildings which surrounded the path. Upon these structures, and upon everywhere the hated gaze of his eye fell, reality began to twist, warping into devolved parodies of their forms, hideous reflections as seen by a madman. Soon enough they were unrecognizable, little more than weeping piles of sanity-blasting ooze which coalesced into the unnatural composites known as mutilith vortex beasts. Across Fenris, the Thousand Sons sensed their father's arrival, and redoubled their efforts, eager to join him at the Fang. Thus the Crimson King marched alongside entire hosts of horrors and flights of screamers, flocks of Zongors and howling packs of Shogal. All of the mutilith host had come to join Magnus the Red as he intuitively sought out the heart of the Fang. Even the most arrogant sorcerers recognized their opportunity for ultimate victory had come, and with a juddering lurch, 8 silver towers relocated instantaneously to hang above the mountainous peaks of the Fang. Perhaps the sole exception to this grand host was Ozek Ahriman, for the Osirian Lord knew there would be none to interrupt the final stages of his plans. For all his might, Magnus the Red was to be little more than a distraction for the time being, a being of such importance and a threat so great that none would be able to turn away. Ahriman's line of thought was more true than he realized, for even as far away as Terra, psychic minds beheld the Great Eye once more, and they wept. For those in the Fenris system itself, all with even a hint of psychic potential sensed the strain weighing down upon reality. The Brotherhood of the Grey Knights, well versed in the progression of demonic incursions, sensed the daemon Primarch's arrival from the moment he slipped from beyond the veil into the Materium, and moved to respond. As always, the weight of numbers had tipped the scales firmly in favor of the Imperium, and thus the departing ships of the Grey Knights did not affect the course of the battle as they began to break away, accelerating towards Fenris at full speed. Aboard the Invincible Reason, the Star Phantoms also sensed the arrival of the Crimson King. Their battle in the void was already nearing its end, the planet's sundering weapons leaving both fleets shells of their former selves. Lost in his own thoughts and delusions, the half-daemon Azrael gave no notice as his flagship began to leave the battle, its bridge officers deciding they had other places to be than in the same system as an insane daemon Primarch. To the half-daemon, such a bold-faced lie appeared to be the truth, for as he peered into the auspex, the signatures of the Imperial fleet were all steadily moving away from the Invincible Reason. The mighty warship had reaped a fearsome toll and had suffered only minor damage, and thus Azrael shrugged and stalked off the bridge, giggling to himself as usual. On the Innocentian Hill declared, the naval officers manning the stations could not believe their luck. Barely half of the mighty task force still floated under their own power, for the Star Phantoms had inflicted heavy losses despite their small numbers. The flagship itself had been crippled, her engines damaged midway through the battle, and thus Lord Inquisitor Karamazov was left to scream at his subordinates for their inability to pursue their retreating enemies. The fleet of the Raven Guard meanwhile had turned their attentions toward the disabled and shattered enemy vessels, ignoring the invincible Reason and Karamazov's hails in favor of recovering the gene seed of their fallen and plundering all the war gear they could salvage. Jarl Blackman's fleet was no more responsive, making for Fenris in pursuit of their High King. The Alfather's Honor, flagship of the High King, was quick for a ship of its bulk, already deploying its forces with utmost urgency. Desperate to save their home, the mighty warship had maneuvered into the upper atmosphere, far beyond the conventional anchor points in order to shave off precious minutes for the troops preparing to land. Hundreds of space wolves began to rain down from on high, the mighty company of the Great Wolf led by Logan Grimner himself. The Thousand Sons by this time were congregating around the Fang itself, thus there was no need to disperse the reinforcements across the whole planet. The mighty High King led from the front, a great axe-wedge formation composed of dozens of individual Deathsworn, the last of their squads, who slammed into the traitors' flanks with utmost fury. By this time, the insane Magnus and his forces had already overwhelmed the lower reaches of the Fang. The depths below held nothing of interest for them, for the forces of Aura Magma had already sundered the lower levels. In the end, the ancient sorcerer and his cabal had been defeated, teleporting away in shame in the face of the power of the Stormacaller and the other rune priests, who defeated the last of the fire daemons before collapsing in exhaustion. Now their heroism seemed to be for naught, for they had expended their might against a foe far lesser than the ones now rampaging through the middle vales of the Fang. As he ascended, the towering behemoth that was Magnus the Red was forced to claw and smash his way through the narrow doorways, ascending up and up through the vast peak. In every corridor and tunnel, fire teams of space wolves attempted to slow him, ambushing the Thousand Sons from every chamber. Though they knew no fear, despair had begun to fill the loyal Asteroutes. The end times had seemingly come, yet their Primarch Leman Russ was nowhere to be found. Their greatest champions were either far away or already fallen. None knew that High King Grimner was on his way, for the external sensors had been sundered by artillery fire after Aura Magma's forces destroyed the generator EMs powering the void shields. The Thousand Sons on the other hand were filled with the prospect of victory. The very presence of their Primarch made them fight with ferocity not seen in millennia, eager to win the favor of Tsiench by destroying the space wolves. Their silver towers rained death upon the outside flanks of the Fang, cleaving countless tons of rock away as they sought to pierce its heart. Defiant batteries attempted to blast them away, but their shields held firm, and thus the bombardment continued. It was much the same within, where the psychic powers of the sorcerers were beyond mighty, slaughtering dozens of space wolves and Valkyria with every strike. Even the knowledge that the Grey Knights and Grimner were about to arrive did not dismay the arrogant scions of Prospero. They had already seized half of the Fang. Once they found and destroyed the gene seed repositories, the space wolves would be doomed. Far from this epic struggle, the schemes of Ahriman were reaching their climax as well. Deep in the heart of the fire breather, the largest volcano on Fenris, the Osirian Lord and his cabal were on the verge of completing their ultimate rituals. Vile energies poured into the heart of Fenris, racking the death world with massive quakes and vast tsunamis as the planet writhed in torment. Countless scraps of energy were extracted and merged with the currents of the Immaterium as their arcane gambit neared its finale. All was now in place, and Fenris had become the perfect echo of Prospero. Now the enemies of the Thousand Sons knew the pain they had felt, of being betrayed by their brothers, of the fear of genetic deviance, of mutation running amok. The blind arrogance of it was astounding, and to such hubris, Tsiench himself turned his attention, peering down at what his servants sought to accomplish. The favor of Tsiench flowed upon his chosen legion like never before. The changer of ways was in the ascendant, for as the 41st millennium came to an end, hope for a brighter future surged throughout the galaxy and countless plots and schemes began their culmination. Within the blazing heart of the fire breather, Ahriman stood within his ritual circle, shaping the warp to his will. His adamantium-encased dreadnought fists plunged into the stone walls of the lava chamber, infusing the tortured stone with mutagenic energy. With a catastrophic rumble, the volcano inverted, its soaring peaks plunging into the earth to form a vast chasm. From the streams of magma deep below the surface of this gullet, a hurricane of Tsianchan daemons poured upward as Ahriman's careless magic further thinned the barriers of reality. At the heart of the storm was Ozek Ahriman himself, surrounded by 4 lords of change and 4 sorcerers of his legion. Together these 9 harnessed and channeled such forces as had not been controlled since Magnus' sown ritual upon the world of Kur during the end days of the Leonine Heresy. Only these chosen few knew the scope of Ahriman's ambitions. The power he had harnessed could have been put to all manner of dark designs, and in that moment, the ultimate decision lay with him. For a time he had considered bringing Sorcerias into real space, to give his legion a permanent base once more. However, he had quickly discarded that ambition, for he knew it would be beyond foolish to remove their fortress from its unassailable position in the Eye of Terror just to give the Imperium a target to focus their overwhelming fury upon. No, the goal of the Osirian Lord was both blindingly arrogant and astoundingly simple, for he sought nothing less than to undo the past. He had spent many centuries studying the actions of his father, of the deals he had struck and the curses he had borne. The festering wound of the flesh change had filled his thoughts and those of his brothers, for 10 millennia. 10 millennia of hopes and prayers, of schemes and plots to undo them, a desire for change the likes of which was hard to match. Ozek knew only through Tsianch could this be undone, and thus in exchange for this reversal, a change of mind for the mind of change, he offered up the doom of Fenris, along with the sacrificed gene seed of 999 space wolves. Across Fenris and beyond, a psychic scream began to keen as a terrifying power emanated from their circle. With a shuddering gasp of triumph, the ritual reached its peak. Reality groaned as the power Ozek had gathered was released, channeled into the warp through the conduits in Ahriman's personal silver tower in a manner no words could possibly convey. Across time and space, every Asteroutes bearing the gene seed of Magnus, past, present, and future, felt their souls touched by the work of Ahriman and the power of Tsianch. In the heart of the Fang, Magnus the Red stopped in his tracks, transfixed by, for the first time in 10,000 years, understanding. The Crimson King rose up in all his terrible glory, his madness slipping away as Ahriman's bargain took effect. All around him, the space wolves stopped in horror, recognizing their foe was once again sentient. A second wave of power struck out, and all the sorcerers felt their powers swell, feeling a new sense of might. A third wave swept forth, and the Shogal began to transform. Their bestial features began to retract as their red skin faded to human skin tones once again. Across the galaxy and the warp, these changes took effect. The atavistic curse of the flesh change had been defeated, Ahriman was triumphant, and the greatest was yet to come. In the heart of the circle, Ahriman felt his shattered body mending. Each wave returned to him the use of the power he had been so long denied, setting him free from the chains fate had placed upon him. With a cry of delight, he burst from the confines of his Osirian sarcophagus, unmaking it with a flick of his fingers. Ozek had won, and with Magnus now fully sentient, there was nothing that could possibly stop them. Chapter 9, Magnus Ascendant. As Ahriman's ritual swept across the galaxy, the 1,000 suns, no matter wherever they found themselves at the end of the 41st millennium, reaped the rewards of their commander's schemes. However, none were more blessed than Magnus himself. For the first time in 10,000 years, he grasped what his fell eye landed upon. His towering intellect, kept from him for so long, had lost none of its wisdom, nor its malice. With a twist of his clawed red hand and a wicked cackle, the Crimson King bent the warp to his will, determined that his first conscious act of witchcraft would be one of unparalleled destruction. The thick stone sides of the Fang, proof against the heaviest of orbital bombardments, dissolved like smoke, leaving a spherical crater. No trace of the adamantium plating remained, simply willed from existence by the cunning craft of Magnus. High above the frozen plains and snow-capped peaks, the starry night sky twinkled with the bursts of distant explosions. In the void, the clustered Imperial warships which had rushed to join in the defense of Fenris, now came under the terrible scrutiny of a single omniscient eye. Once more the Crimson King twisted his hands into arcane gestures, reshaping reality at a whim. Magnus pulled, and a trio of strike cruisers were wrenched from their positions in the void, careening into each other with devastating kinetic force. The sky was lit up as the unlucky vessels vanished in a cascade of explosions, and the halls of the Fang echoed with Magnus' laughter. Across Fenris, The Space Wolves responded to this destruction, abandoning their current battles to race toward the Fang. All knew that the Crimson King represented a far greater threat than any of them had ever faced. However, the Thousand Sons were far from idle, and inflicted a punishing barrage on their retreating foes. The sorcerers, empowered anew by Ahriman's ritual, shifted the very landscape around them, bending reality so that no matter how they struggled, the Sons of Rus could not escape them. The Shogal, no longer bestial mutants, resumed their forms as Astaroths, the wargear of yesteryear manifesting to aid them who were as eager to fight as they had been before their transformation, and quickly proved they had lost none of their skill. Thus was the home of the Sixth denied much-needed reinforcements as a series of battles erupted around the thick ice sheets and tundra forests surrounding the Fang. However, while sorcery ensnared and slowed the Space Wolves, their allies were not so hindered. Within a few hours, the first vessels of the Grey Knights had moved into position above the Fang as every company of the silver-armored Third Brotherhood prepared to join the fight. Though the Sons of Titan often entered a battle by means of teleportation, the intense psychic disturbances on the planet's surface meant such an attempt would be risky in the extreme, and thus only a select few chose to utilize teleportation. For the rest of the Sons of Titan, including the entire complement of exorcists, drop pods, and transports would have to do. All knew it was far better to be delayed in their arrival rather than lose a quarter of their men in the vagaries of the warp, especially when facing a threat as great as Magnus the Red. It was only the blessings of the Emperor that shielded the Grey Knights from the worst of Magnus' fury as they landed. A flight of aircraft swooped by, strafing the Chaos Space Marines as they deposited teleport homers. In a dozen dazzling flashes of light, dozens of silver-armored Terminators materialized around the Crimson King, along with no less than 5 Nemesis Dread Knights. The Sons of Titan opened fire upon Magnus, who simply stood there as his foes unleashed hundreds of shots on him from all sides. As the last of the wrist-mounted storm bolters clicked dry, the Lord of Prospero swept the smoke away with his wings, revealing himself to be utterly unharmed. The Daemon Primarch gestured once more, his hands now revealed to be holding his ancient poliarm, the mighty blade of Magnus. The Crimson King's cyclopean face twisted in a sneer of infinite malice as he manifested his counter-attack, clawing at the smoky air as it coalesced into a collection of projected memories from the ancient past. Suddenly the Daemon Primarch was surrounded by his sons. There stood Sanact, his twin blades gleaming as he leapt into battle. There went Amon, his staff smashing half a dozen Grey Knights to the ground. A clattering stream of shells hit the ground as the orange-lacquered automaton Cretans blasted away, towering above its master Ignis, who stood beside Ormuzd Ahriman, resplendent in his Mark II power armor. All of the Crimson King's favored sons, or at least their phantasms, unleashed a punishing barrage on the Grey Knights' infantry. Yet even in the heat of battle, there were those that noted that Ozek Ahriman, architect of this entire invasion, was not among their ranks. Now free to focus on the greater threat, Magnus turned his attention to the 5 Nemesis Dread Knights. What paltry fire had been sent their way washed harmlessly from their force shields, but the Daemon Primarch possessed attacks far more deadly than his minions. The blade of Magnus reached out, and as its tip touched the first Dread Knight, reality distorted. The Warsoot's defenses instantly overloaded in the same instant as the runic warding protecting its pilot, whose body was transformed into a hideous chaos spawn that began to claw its way out of its harness now burning with unearthly flames. The horns jutting from Magnus' body glowed with a brilliant halo of light as a sphere of warp energy appeared between them, an orb which shot out to pierce another pair of Dread Knights, which flattened before imploding as though they had been stepped on by an Imperator Titan. The remaining 2 Dread Knights, which had closed in unheeding of their comrades' swift demise, swung their towering hammers at the Crimson King, but to their dismay, their blows were caught in midair. With little effort, Magnus wrenched the weapons from his foes' hands, throwing them aside and hissing as his claws were singed by their warded heads. Now unarmed, the Dread Knights were helpless as the red-skinned giant bisected the first one with a sweeping jab before ripping the limbs off of the second with utmost ease. The entire battle had taken less than a minute, but it had been enough. His position now confirmed, half a dozen strike cruisers opened fire on the Daemon Primarch from the heavens, determined to wipe him from the face of Fenris. However, Magnus was no fool. Stretching one hand up with impossible reflexes, he caught the lance strikes in midair with a kind shield of astounding potency. The glowing psychic ward angled downward, sending the beams back at a column of approaching land raiders rumbling up the slopes of the Fang. The mighty war machines vanished one by one as the fury of the orbital bombardment struck them, making a mockery of their thick armor. From his position at the rear of the column, Thanjar foresaw his death approaching, and reacted accordingly. The champion leapt from his command cupola, rolling as he landed to a kneel on the snowy ground. Jarnulf raised a las cannon, unleashing a ruby beam aimed with impeccable precision at Magnus' Sai. Such a blow, moving at light speed, should have been impossible to dodge, and even a creature of the warp such as a daemon would surely have been grievously wounded. However, the las cannon shot never reached its target. With but a thought, the world around Magnus froze. The Crimson King strode across the unmoving battlefield, moving around the petrified light still hanging in midair until he stood above Jarnulf. He snapped his fingers, and suddenly the brave son of Rus now stood where the Crimson King had once been. With a groaning lurch, time began once more, and Jarnulf looked down to find his lower torso had been obliterated by his own shot. The Asteroutes tumbled to the ground, already dead, but Magnus had already moved past him, unleashing still more sorceries. 9 kilometers away, an entire company of space wolves clutched their chests, their twin hearts no longer beating as their veins turned to crystal. A trio of Stormhawk interceptors tumbled from the sky, their pilots rendered insane by demonic whispers breathed from the thoughts of the Crimson King. In the aurora-filled void above Fenris, the forces of the Imperium found themselves beset with doubt. The casualty rates had become exponentially higher since the Crimson King regained his sanity. Already half a company of Grey Knights, among the most powerful fighters at their disposal, lay dead, slaughtered with ease by Magnus. Reality itself had begun to break down as the forces of change wrought havoc across the system. The thought of the Crimson King, whose magics further warped Fenris with every passing second, left free to roam the galaxy was a risk far too great to leave to chance. For the first time since the Leonine Heresy and the Scouring, the Imperium began to contemplate the destruction of an Asteroot's home world. For Fenris to become a daemon world would be far too devastating to morale, but to convince the Sons of Rus to permit their allies to destroy their home was no less daunting a task. When talk of such a plan began to spread across the fleet gathered above Fenris, the outrage of the wolves was palpable. Only the arrival of High King Grimnir's forces stopped the Space Wolves from turning upon their Imperial Navy counterparts. The Legion Master was quick to table such fratricidal discussion, rallying his forces for one final assault upon the surface. They would save the Fang, Grimnir declared, or die trying. Thus the skies of Fenris were filled anew with hundreds of drop pods that rained down through the aurora and sleet toward the imposing peaks of the Fang. This mighty assault was preceded by a spectacular array of lance strikes as dozens of warships fired down upon Fenris, all thought of collateral damage rendered moot by the threat they faced. Even the mightiest of the Thousand Suns struggled to protect their forces against the fury of the heavens, vanishing in brief flashes of light as the orbital bombardment annihilated both them and their Space Wolves' adversaries. Magnus himself bore the brunt of this assault, and though no shot pierced his mighty kine shields, his attention was taken away. Thus the hail of drop pods was able to land relatively unharmed, hundreds of warriors spoiling for a fight who otherwise would have been torn from the skies by the fury of Magnus. At the head of this mighty assault was High King Logan Grimnir alongside Jarl Ragnar Blackmane, warriors of such renown that their mere presence inspired their kin to fight harder than ever before. Beside them were the forces of Grand Master Orican, stepping forth from the heart of bright novas of silvery white light as their teleportation flares blinked out. As one the psychic brotherhoods of Titan raised their arms, unleashing a hail of Psybolt ammunition into the forces of the Thousand Suns. Their indomitable wills contended with daemons and sorcerers, overpowering their opponents with perfect teamwork born of decades of experience. Fickle change swept over Fenris once more as what had appeared to be an inevitable victory for the forces of Magnus now balanced the other way, a stalemate that could tip either way paid for by hundreds of dead Asteroutes. Yet it may well have proven too late. The defenders of the Fang had been overcome, blasted aside and mutated beyond recognition as Magnus Rufus strode inexorably forth toward the gene seed repositories at the heart of the Fang's apothecariums. The destruction of these reserves, coupled with the severe losses inflicted to the 6th Legion this day both here and across the galaxy, would doom the Sons of Rus to a lingering death, unable to regain their former size and glory. However, as he neared the chambers, the Crimson King was challenged from behind, for as the Butcher's bill tallied ever higher, Magnus the Red found himself confronted anew, for High King Grimnir, Grand Master Orokin, and their retinue had finally reached the fane. It would have taken but a second for Magnus to complete his objective, but as always, pride, and a fierce determination to humiliate his foes before destroying them, ruled his heart. As if fate sensed this climactic struggle about to unfold, the battles across Fenris and beyond reached a fever pitch, the ultimate crescendo toward a climax that would determine the fate of not only the system but a legion entire. Thus the Crimson King turned to give battle, determined to lay low his ancient foes once and for all. He would break Russ's descendants just as they had once broken him long ago at Prospero. He would twist Russ's home into such a deformity that he would never recognize it were he to return. The loyal sons of the Imperium were no less determined, sure in their purpose and righteous in their hatred for the Witch King Magnus and his demonic ilk. They would cast him from reality, back to the hells from whence he came, to stop him no matter the cost. As the Imperial champions neared the towering form of the Crimson King, reality itself began to break down around them. Anathema to natural order, the ground around the daemon began to heave and fluctuate, the very terrain itself becoming dangerous as tree roots writhed like snakes through rock that had become a slurry of mud. Lesser warriors would have been halted completely, but for Astaroths such as these, it merely slowed them down. The runes etched on their armor glowed with white-hot intensity, automatically reacting in an attempt to stave off the mutative touch of the warp. Yet this was merely the first obstacle to overcome. Though never one of the most skilled with the blade, Magnus Rufus was nonetheless a primarch, a demigod son of the Emperor even before he had left his mortal body behind, whose reach and initiative was far beyond any other present. Thus as the Astaroths slowed even fractionally, Magnus swung his mighty blade, swiftly piercing the stout Terminator armor of one of Grimnir's guardians, along with 3 others beside him. The last of these, seeing the instant death that had befallen his brethren, twisted aside, his instinct serving to dodge the worst of Magnus' blows. Yet such was the potency of the Crimson King's Sorcerer's blade that, though merely scratched, the unfortunate warrior began to mutate. With a scream of agony, the Space Wolf fell to his knees, spined tentacles erupting from his armor as his skin sloughed off. In place of this once mighty warrior was left only a gibbering chaos spawn, which launched itself to be put down by its former brothers. As his blade staff swept backwards, Magnus' remaining blows were directed at the Grey Knights, who fared little better. Though better protected from the Crimson King's Sorcerer's backwash, their sanctified armor proved just as susceptible to the blade of Magnus as their Space Wolf allies, and 2 of Orokin's men fell, their blood steaming into rancid vapors in the cold. Yet their sacrifice would not go unavenged. A dozen nemesis weapons struck home, their holy blades inordinately effective against Magnus' demonic flesh. Falchions flashed and staves glowed blinding silver as they hacked away, turning crimson flesh maroon as demonic ichor seeped from a dozen wounds. The Daemon Primarch leapt back as daemon hammers swung with concussive force at his kneecaps, his iridescent wings wrapped around his torso as Cybolt ammunition blasted away. The sons of Russ were no less fierce, lightning claws and frost axes hacking away at the Sorcerer's apparitions guarding the Crimson King. One by one, the ghostly memories faded away, banished back to the realm of thought. A trio of rune priests called upon the world spirit of Mother Fenris, channeling the Tempest's wrath into a roaring storm that they unleashed against Magnus in an attempt to keep him from flying. The Daemon Primarch roared, infuriated that his foes would attempt to utilize their psychic gifts against the Master of Sorcery. With but a thought he dispelled their hurricane winds, before turning his attention to the Grey Knights librarians who were about to unleash their own Psychona. The lucky ones found themselves speaking in the dark tongue of daemons, their powers merely delayed as they attempted to undo the damage wrought upon their minds. Those less fortunate discovered they no longer had tongues with which to speak or fingers with which to trace symbols. One by one, the first wave of warriors attacking Magnus fell, slain by the Crimson King by blade and sorcery. Once more his attention turned to sorcery, undoing the damage wrought upon his monstrous form with but a thought. His mighty crown blazed with a supernova halo as his august thoughts rewrote reality to a form more pleasing to him. Those space wolves who had once stood at his feet now found themselves many leagues away, manifested in the midst of the 1,000 suns as though summoned. They thus reacted accordingly, turning their blades upon these sudden targets. None thought to question why their ancient foes wore silver armor, or pleaded with them to halt their attack. Only the most stubborn sons of Russ refused to be torn from their goal, reserving their hate for Magnus himself as they pressed forward. Unfortunately for the chosen of Tzientch, the young wolf and the old wolf were two warriors of such singular focus. Jarl Ragnar Blackmane had a long history of opposing the Thousand Sons, both across the galaxy and here on Fenris. He let loose a bone-chilling howl matched by the roar of his legendary Frost Fang slicing through the air as he rushed in, moving far more swiftly than Grimnir, who was fractionally more encumbered by his heavy Terminator armor. Yet for all his innate skill as a swordsman, Blackmane found himself outmatched. Magnus' already impressive skill, honed during the Great Crusade, was now boosted still more by sorcery. His precognition made a mockery of Ragnar's natural talent, and soon the young wolf found himself on the defensive, desperately parrying just to stay alive. It was only the presence of his allies that kept him alive in that dire moment. Grand Master Orikan was a rock upon which Magnus' fury broke again and again, chanting litanies of banishment along with his psychic kin. They were the Third Brotherhood, the Ward Makers, the company of Ianus himself, who were the greatest psychers in all of Titan. While none could hope to overcome the Sorcerer King of Prospero on their own, together they refused to be overmatched. The Purifiers were untouched by the forces of change, focusing their wills in a battle of minds as sharp daggers of psychic hate and condemnation that stabbed into vulnerable points in Magnus' psyche. Brother Captains Voldus and Stern were twin beacons of silver light, channeling their own strength, along with their brethren, into Grand Master Orikan, supercharging his strength and speed to the point of nearly rivaling Magnus' own. The Psychic Brotherhood of the Third lived up to their name, combining their minds into a psychic gestalt that unraveled Magnus' sorceries one by one even as they shielded their commander. However, even greater than these was the Harfylker. Logan Grimnir had not been fooled by the visions created by Magnus' silver tongue. The old wolf had seen too much to give any heed to the deceitful servants of Tsiench, and he struck like a meteor, barreling into his foe without heed for Magnus' size. His mighty weapon, the axe of Morkai, glowed with baleful light, the daemon within now more active than ever before in the presence of witches. Wherever it struck, the axe left great bloody scars, thrumming with the power of the warp as it hacked away ensorcelled flesh and enchanted armor like it was made of paper. The mighty Grimnir gripped his trophy weapon with both hands as he faced his foe, going all out on offense as he relied on both his allies and the protection of his ancient belt of rust to defend him from harm. Seconds turned into minutes as the Imperium's finest warriors fought to turn the tide against Magnus. Though none could match the Daemon Primarch one-on-one, together they were truly mighty, too numerous to be swatted aside as nearly 30 warriors battled with bolt and blade. They suffered horrific casualties, burned and mutated and slashed in all manner of gruesome deaths, but they would not relent, for they knew that if they could not defeat Magnus here, then Fenris would be destroyed. Alas for these heroes, time was not on their side. Each warrior that fell lessened the damage wrought upon the Crimson King's mutable form, which swiftly twisted back into shape if left to heal for more than a few seconds. With a deafening roar, Magnus straightened up, finally tired of stomping and hacking at the ants stinging his feet. His most dangerous weapon, denied to him for so long, had always been his mind. His foul imagination and wisdom was entwined with an innate mastery of the warp seen in no other save the Emperor himself. First to feel his wrath were the Grey Knights, for he knew all too well that their rites of banishment were a far greater threat than the more mundane blades piercing his flesh. The Crimson King stretched forth a clawed talon, infusing his will into a bolt of change that leapt forth into Grand Master Orikan. For a brief moment, his warded true silver armor glowed a blinding aura as it protected him, but Magnus' attack was too subtle. He did not seek to overcome the protection of the Ward Makers, but to subvert it. The Grand Master let out an awful scream, a cry of purest despair and agony never before heard from a son of Titan. Suddenly all the power that Orikan's allies were feeding him was changed into pure warp energy, which surged over the Grey Knight like a tidal wave. Silver light became gold in a foul jest that only Magnus found amusing as Orikan's flesh lived up to its namesake. When the nova faded, an unmoving statue made of fool's gold stood in the place of the Grand Master. The death of their focal point threw the gestalt mind of the Grey Knights off balance, for without a target, their energies became jumbled and confused, a backlash that temporarily severed their unity. At the sight of his allies' horrific death, Grimnir bellowed in fury. Taking advantage of his foe's momentary inattention, he sunk the axe of Morkai deep into Magnus' chest, provoking an unearthly wail of hate and pain. The Crimson King turned his attention away from the Grey Knights toward the Harfylker, seizing him in his clawed grip. Servo motors groaned and warning lights blinked in Grimner's helm as the daemon Primarch squeezed, adamantium and ceramite buckling seconds before bones snapped. Before the horrified eyes of Black Mane, recovering on the ground from where the Crimson King had kicked him backwards, High King Logan Grimner was crushed. As the old wolf went limp, Magnus hurled him to the ground, the ponderous bulk of his ruined Terminator armor leaving a crater in the ground. The Sorcerer King reared to his full height, his towering form the size of a Questoris pattern knight, battered and bleeding but still defiant. Yet here now, in his moment of triumph, where his foes were too weak to stop him, Magnus Rufus stopped dead in his tracks, his all-seeing eye fixed far into the distance. Far away off the coast of Asaheim, across the forests and thick sheets of pack ice where space wolves and thousand suns continued their battles, the chasms of the gullet glowed with unearthly power. Once the towering fire-breather, the ancient volcano had been transformed by Ahriman. The Osirian lord, now free of his sarcophagus, had reveled in his newly regained freedom, but soon enough turned his attention back toward his plot. Ambition had always ruled him, the desire to see his plans through no matter what the cost to his allies. Now his ritual sight, bolstered beyond any sane limit by his returned psychic skill, thrummed with barely contained power. Thus as the battle at the Fang reached its crescendo, so too did Ahriman's grand design. The first few steps, of undoing the changes wrought upon the Shogal and returning Magnus' mind and his own body, had merely been the precursor to his ultimate aim of preventing such calamities from ever occurring again. Once more power rippled across space and time, the power of the warp channeled once more to the will of one Astaroths. The same rubric of Ahriman that had touched upon each and every legionary bearing the gene seed of the 15th to transform them back into their proper forms, infusing them with wards painstakingly devised through eons of research. It was an act of the highest arrogance and unbridled hope, of supreme self-confidence tempered by consummate skill. Even Magnus was forced to finally take note of this overlooked son at long last. It seemed Ahriman's skill, long denied him in his dreadnought sarcophagus, was revealed to be unimaginably potent. Yet the Legion Master of the Thousand Suns had not reckoned with the conflicting wills of Tsianch. The Changer of Ways was long accustomed to arguing with itself, for each Lord of Change represented a separate thought in the mind of the Architect of Fate. Tsianch both smiled and frowned as he beheld the rubric of Ahriman, for while it would empower his servant legion like never before, it would also render them less dependent on him. However, the great conspirator had already accounted for this, and every other eventuality in fact, and so he simply had to watch as Ahriman hanged himself with the rope he had been given. The surges of power doubled, and then trebled, and suddenly the Osirian lord found that his allies could not keep up with him. The other ritualists in his circle vanished, some dying messy deaths while others vanished entirely. Without dampeners and channels for this august power, Ahriman let out a wail of frustration as the energies he wielded slipped beyond his control. They swept over time and space, across both the materium and immaterium, and where they struck, the Thousand Suns were staggered. The most powerful among them, the sorcerers, struggled to cope with this influx of power, desperately striving to convert into a form that would increase their own reserves of might. However, their kin were not so fortunate. The rest of the sons of Magnus, formerly the bestial Shogal who formed the vast majority of the 15th Legion, had been unable to call upon their power in any meaningful way as their Sorcerous kin had. Thus they lacked the capacity to channel the unbound energies of Ahriman's rubric in the same way. The unlucky Astaroths stiffened in their armor as the capacity for change was taken from them. Their very flesh desiccated and crumbled away, leaving only dust inside unmoving suits of armor. Back at the Fang, Magnus felt this surge of power, helplessly observing with his all-seeing eye as his sons crumbled into dust. The Crimson King instantly teleported himself to Ahriman's side, still clutching at the wound Grimner had dealt him as his fury mixed with anguish and fear in a way he had not felt since the burning of Prospero 10,000 years earlier. Ahriman himself lay on his back at the center of his ruined ritual circle, his mind a jumbled mixture of conflicting emotions filled with the same terrible knowledge of these unforeseen consequences that filled his father's mind. Upon seeing the architect of his legion's ruin, Magnus Rufus screamed at his son, demanding that he undo the damage he had wrought, to give him back his legion. Yet the Osirian lord could not, helpless in the face of insurmountable grief at the fate which he had inadvertently brought upon his brothers. Though he wished for nothing more than to strike his wayward son down, Magnus was nothing but a creature of Tsianch. No matter what spells and incantations he attempted to inflict upon his prodigal son, it seemed the changer of ways did not wish to lose such a valuable pawn. With a howl of disgust, Magnus called upon his powers for a different purpose, teleporting his legion, both alive and dead, away from Fenris. Across the Fenris system, the unmoving Rubrisi were whisked away back to the planet of the sorcerers. Without their support, the hordes of cultists were swiftly exterminated by the vengeful sons of Rus. Soon enough every daemon that blighted Fenris had been discorporated once more, leaving behind nothing but a twisted and ruined landscape whose scars seemed unlikely to heal. Over the following weeks, the Inquisition would enact a series of purges upon the Fenris system, ensuring the taint of chaos had been expunged as they sought to hide how close the Thousand Sons had come to destroying the home of their ancient foe. Millions of civilians were systematically executed, all who had witnessed daemons both on Fenris and beyond, in order to hide the nature of chaos. However, some scars could never be erased. Midgardia was nothing more than a field of rubble in the void, while the glaciers of Frostheim had melted away, leaving strange fields of bone. Oceanic Svelgard was not purged of the invaders for many weeks, as the key ornate forces of Arkgar fought to the last until they were finally extirpated, leaving only bloody tides and charnel houses in their wake. However, no amount of vengeance did not make up for the loss of hundreds of slain space wolves, including High King Grimnir himself. As Magnus vanished from the Fane, reality returned back to normal once more. As it did, the old wolf woke long enough to name Jarl Ragnar Blackmane as his successor, gasping out his dying breaths before perishing from his wounds. Though grief-stricken, High King Blackmane was highly active, organizing suitable funerals for his predecessor and for the thousands of slain space wolves. The Grey Knights and Inquisition departed after Grimnir's funeral, much against the will of Lord Inquisitor Karamazov. Recognizing how weak the space wolves were in this time of succession, the first in centuries, Karamazov sought to introduce checks upon their power, to firmly establish the Inquisition's supremacy over them. However, to his frustration, his forces refused to go along with this plan. The Raven Guard had already departed, vanishing from the Fenris system after the last daemons had been eliminated along with a substantial trove of plundered war gear. The new Grand Master of the Grey Knights, Voldus, had elected to move on, making for the Kadayan Gate despite the heavy losses they had suffered. Thus left with nothing but a decimated force of Imperial Guard and Sororitas, Karamazov knew he could not presently reign in the Space Wolves as he would have liked to, and departed as well, leaving High King Ragnar and the Space Wolves to their own devices. Though he had not been truly banished, Magnus the Red did not show himself again for many years after the Battle of Fenris. Upon Sorcerias, the Crimson King sought to undo Ahriman's mistakes by every means he could think of, but Tzeentch did not bless him in this endeavor, even going so far as to directly forbid him from slaying Ahriman. Instead Magnus banished Ahriman, sending him and his followers to roam the galaxy. The Osirian Lord had finally stepped out of his twin's shadow, but still he lacked the father's approval he had always desired. Ahriman was thus left to gaze into the past in the hopes of undoing his mistakes as always. In time these prodigal sons would reveal themselves again, but for now, their fate would remain a mystery. The sons of Prospero have struck us a grievous blow. The loss of so many space wolves, and more importantly Grey Knights, have rendered the Imperium vulnerable. We cannot allow the tides of the warp to swamp us, to overturn the bark of the Imperium. Thus by order of the Council of the Lords Temporal, Martial, and Ecclesiarchal of the most divine and righteous Imperium of mankind, the ancient weapons must be unleashed once more, to hurl back the darkness. Thus do we declare the Dispensatus Anathema. By the will of him upon the golden throne, let the silent sisters walk among us once more. Decree of the Senatorum Imperialis, 999.m41. Check the description for the links to the author.